Hey guys, tonight we begin with the long-forgotten world of the village miller. A figure so ordinary, so quietly woven into the fabric of daily survival, that history itself nearly let them slip away. Yet, without their steady hands guiding waterwheels and tending grindstones, much of rural life would have faltered. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this little community gathering across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe let the sound of a fan or distant traffic become the background murmur, and let's step together into the slow-turning world of the forgotten mill. Let's set the scene. Long before the steady turn of wooden wheels by village streams, long before the tall silhouettes of windmills marked the horizon of medieval fields, there was only the simplest motion of stone against stone. The act of grinding grain into edible form is one of the oldest human labors, a work that appeared not suddenly, but gradually, as communities shifted from foraging to farming. It was, in its earliest stages, less a profession than a necessity, a daily rhythm that accompanied the slow domestication of wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent nearly 10,000 years ago. Archaeologists trace the beginnings of milling to the use of handheld stones, the rudimentary mortars and pestles of the Neolithic world. The act was repetitive and slow, demanding patience as women and sometimes children pressed grain kernels into flour fine enough for primitive breads and porridges. These querns, as they came to be known, were often nothing more than flat slabs of stone, worn smooth by centuries of use, paired with a smaller stone moved back and forth until the grain yielded. The sound of grinding was already present in those earliest villages, an unremarkable noise, like a background hum that blended with the voices of animals, the crackle of firewood, and the murmur of human survival. Over time, these tools became slightly more sophisticated. The saddle quern, named for its shallow curved surface resembling a saddle's shape, spread widely across agricultural societies. Its rhythm was steady, a forward and backward motion that wore on the shoulders and arms, yet produced enough flour to sustain households. It was never glamorous work, never praised in story or song, but it was indispensable. And in this labor, repeated countless times by anonymous hands, one can glimpse the earliest outlines of what would eventually become the miller's craft. By the time of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, milling had grown into a task with recognizable forms and dedicated spaces. Wall paintings from tombs depict servants grinding grain with querns, their posture bent, their bodies frozen in the enduring act of pressing stone against stone. The grain itself was sacred, tied to fertility and abundance, tied to the gods who promised life through sustenance. Bread, the outcome of this grinding, became the staple food of civilizations, and so the act of milling, however mundane, was already central to human existence. It is in these quiet origins that one begins to see the shadow of the miller, not yet a distinct figure, but a role bound to survival, a caretaker of the most basic transformation, grain into flour, seed into sustenance. Unlike the smith or the potter, whose crafts left behind distinctive artifacts and proud signatures, the grinder of grain left only the faint wear of stone tools and the dusty traces of flour. Their contribution was absorbed into daily life, taken for granted, and forgotten even in its own time. With the rise of the classical world, technology began to intervene. The Greeks and Romans, attentive to engineering and mechanical advantage, experimented with rotary querns, where a circular upper stone was turned upon a fixed, lower stone. This was a small revolution. The motion shifted from back-and-forth labor to circular grinding, a rhythm that could be more efficient and less punishing on the body. These hand-operated rotary querns spread throughout the Mediterranean, and with them came the first hints of professional millers, individuals who might grind for others in exchange for grain or payment. Still, the process remained human-powered until the gradual discovery that natural forces, animals, water, and wind, could be harnessed. In Roman times, watermills began to appear, turning rivers into engines for daily sustenance. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, described waterwheels in the 1st century BCE, noting their ability to lift the burden of grinding from human shoulders. The river, flowing ceaselessly, could turn wooden paddles, which in turn drove the heavy millstones with a patient, unstoppable motion. What had once required the weary muscles of servants could now be achieved with the quiet power of moving water. The spread of watermills across Europe after the fall of Rome was uneven, but steady. By the early Middle Ages, they became common fixtures wherever rivers and streams permitted. The sight of a mill house by running water, the sound of its creaking wheel and turning gears, became part of the landscape of villages. With it, the figure of the miller finally emerged as a recognizable occupation. Unlike the farmer who sowed and reaped, the miller specialized in the transformation of raw grain into flour, standing as an intermediary between field and table. Windmills followed somewhat later, first recorded in Persia by the 9th century, and gradually making their way into Europe by the 12th. Where rivers were absent or unreliable, wind provided the energy, catching in sails that turned high wooden shafts and set the millstones in motion. The windmill's profile, stark against the sky, became an emblem of human ingenuity in rural landscapes. Yet, even as technology advanced, the essence of milling remained the same, the steady, unhurried reduction of grain into flour. It was not an art, nor a pursuit of beauty, but a quiet endurance, a labor that bound communities together by sustaining their most basic need. In the earliest querns, in the heavy rotary stones of Rome, in the waterwheels and windmills of the Middle Ages, one finds the same principle repeated endlessly, patiently, without drama. The ancient roots of milling remind us that history's foundations rest not on battles or kings, but on the slow, repetitive actions that fed the many. The miller's role, however invisible, grew from this soil of necessity. Without it, bread would not have been possible, and without bread, civilizations could not have thrived. It is in the overlooked grind of stone against stone that the true rhythms of history can be heard, slow, steady, and forgotten by most, yet essential to all. By the early medieval centuries, the village was already forming into its familiar pattern: clustered cottages of wattle and daub, narrow strips of field running outward into the countryside, a church spire or wooden chapel marking the center of spiritual life, and somewhere nearby, often by a flowing stream, the quiet bulk of the mill. It was not always a grand structure, nor was it always a beautiful one, but its presence was unmistakable. The mill was more than a building. It was a mechanism around which the rhythm of village life began to turn. The mill, in its earliest medieval forms, was almost always water-driven. Rivers and streams had long been harnessed for irrigation, fishing, and as sources of fresh drinking water, but in the Middle Ages they became engines of mechanical transformation. A carefully placed mill race diverted a portion of the water's flow, channeling it toward a large wooden wheel. The wheel itself turned slowly, its paddles catching the current, and that measured rotation was transferred inward through a system of shafts, gears, and cogs. Heavy millstones, cut from quarries and painstakingly dressed with furrows, turned patiently upon one another, grinding grain into flour. The villagers, watching the wheel's steady turning, could see their survival mirrored in its motion. It is difficult to exaggerate how central bread had become to the medieval diet. For many peasants, especially in northern Europe, bread was not merely a staple, but often the main portion of their daily food intake. Porridges, soups, and occasional meat or fish supplemented it. But bread was the backbone, and bread was impossible without flour, and flour, in the age of the village, depended on the mill. Thus, the arrival of a mill was not simply an improvement in convenience. It was a reorientation of life itself. Before mechanical mills became common, grain was ground at home by hand with small querns. The work was punishing and slow. For a household to make enough flour for a day's bread, hours of manual grinding were required, usually by women and children. The transition from hand querns to watermills relieved this labor, shifting the burden from human muscle to the ceaseless movement of water. It was a quiet revolution, and its impact rippled across communities. Families could spend less time grinding, and more time in the fields, tending animals, weaving cloth, or maintaining their homes. A hidden economy of hours, released from back-breaking routine, began to shape rural productivity. The presence of a mill also altered the social map of a village. People came not just to grind their grain, but to wait their turn, to see their neighbors, to exchange small pieces of news, to share complaints about weather or lordly taxes. The mill became, in this way, a gathering place, never as central as the church, never as celebratory as the village green, but a point of intersection nonetheless. Children lingered to watch the wheel turn. Elders leaned on their staffs as they waited. Gossip moved as steadily as the water through the channel. Yet, the mill's arrival was not without complexity. In much of Europe, mills were rarely privately owned in the modern sense. They often belonged to the local lord, or to a monastery, tied into the feudal economy. Villages, bound by custom and obligation, were frequently required to bring their grain only to the lord's mill and pay a portion of the flour in return. A fee known as multure. The miller who managed the daily operations collected these fees, and this gave rise to the widespread suspicion of dishonesty. If flour seemed short, if the measures appeared unequal, villagers blamed the miller, and so he became a figure both necessary and mistrusted. Still, the economic role of the mill ensured its endurance. Lords and monasteries invested in mills because they were reliable sources of revenue. A steady stream of grain came in after every harvest, and with it, the assurance of flour, bread, and profit. The technology of milling was therefore protected, and even expanded. By the High Middle Ages, multiple mill complexes were common, with fulling mills for cloth, sawmills for timber, and even hammer mills for metalwork, all driven by water. But it was the grain mill, the humblest of all, that touched every villager's life. In northern regions, where rivers froze in winter, or flowed too erratically, windmills began to make their presence known. The tall wooden towers, their sails stretched against the sky, became landmarks across flat landscapes, especially in England, the Low Countries, and later parts of Germany and France. The windmill required careful placement, exposed to prevailing winds, and skill in maintaining its sails. But once established, it provided another source of mechanical power, where water was unreliable. The spread of mills reshaped landscapes, as much as they reshaped communities. Watercourses were diverted, mill ponds created, meadows flooded to provide steady flow. Paths were worn into the earth by the steady tread of villagers bringing grain to the mill house. Mills introduced a rhythm that was seasonal as well as daily. At harvest they became crowded and busy, the turning of the wheel continuous, day and night, until all the gathered grain had been reduced to flour. In the lean months of winter and spring, the mill was quieter, its stones turning less frequently, its wheel creaking in slow accompaniment to the stillness of the village. Culturally too, the mill began to embed itself in the medieval imagination. It appeared in folk tales, in sermons, and in moral lessons. The endless turning of the wheel was likened to the cycles of life, the grinding of the stones to the inevitability of mortality. In some regions, millers were linked with superstition, thought to be cunning, sly, or even associated with darker forces, perhaps because their work seemed mysterious to those who did not understand the machinery within. The mill was a place of transformation, and transformation always carried a hint of unease. Despite suspicion, the mill endured as a fixture of the medieval landscape, as inseparable from village life as the church, the manor, and the fields themselves. Its arrival marked a shift not only in technology, but in social and economic structure, pulling households into a shared dependence on mechanical power, and on the figure of the miller who tended it. By the late Middle Ages, to imagine a village without a mill would have been almost impossible. The wheel turning by the stream, the steady grind of stone, the dusting of flour on the miller's clothing, these were not extraordinary sights, but ordinary ones, repeated across thousands of communities, generation after generation, and in that ordinariness lay the foundation for survival. The mill was not dramatic, not heroic, but it was essential. Its arrival had bound the rhythms of the village to the rhythms of water and wind, and through them, to the steady turning of time itself. To imagine the medieval mill is to imagine not only a building of timber and stone, but a carefully arranged mechanism, a union of human craft and natural force, created for one purpose only, to turn grain into flour. It was not a grand structure in most villages, rarely ornamented, rarely described in chronicles, yet to those who entered it, the mill possessed a quiet atmosphere of its own. Its walls absorbed the sounds of creaking wood and grinding stone, Its air was thick with flour dust and the faint scent of damp wood and river water. From the outside, the mill might have appeared unremarkable. A low stone base supported walls of timber, patched with wattle and daub, or in later centuries, sturdy planks. A pitched roof, often thatched, shielded the interior from rain, yet the building always carried a subtle asymmetry, the extension of a wheel on one side, half submerged in the steady current of the diverted mill race. This water wheel, turning slowly and without end, marked the structure as something different from cottages or barns. The sound of water slapping against paddles, the groan of the wheel's axle, announced the presence of hidden power. Entering the mill house meant stepping into a dim and dusty space, where beams of sunlight, filtering through narrow slits or gaps in the planking, caught the suspended particles of flour in pale columns. The floor was uneven, worn by the tread of countless feet, and by the shifting of heavy sacks of grain. The scent of grain itself lingered everywhere, sweet and earthy when fresh, sour when damp, a faint mustiness when old. This was no place of leisure. Every surface bore marks of labor. At the center of the building's purpose stood the millstones, typically two large circular stones, one fixed the bedstone, and the other turning above it, the runner stone. Together performed the actual grinding. Their surfaces were carefully dressed with furrows, carved in patterns that guided the kernels inward, and crushed them into flour as they passed outward again. The stones were immense, often 4 or 5 feet in diameter, weighing many hundreds of kilograms. Their slow turning was the heart of the mill's operation, a sound somewhere between a rumble and a sigh, resonating through the timbers. Supporting this motion was an intricate system of wooden gears and shafts. From the wheel outside, the rotation was carried inward by a horizontal shaft, which connected to a vertical shaft rising into the mill house. Large wooden cogs, cut and shaped by hand, meshed with lantern pinions, transferring motion upward. The miller's eye had to be constantly alert, for these wooden teeth wore down unevenly, splintered or shifted out of place. A single break could silence the whole mechanism. Yet when working properly, the gears moved with a slow inevitability, their creaks and groans becoming as familiar as the sound of the river itself. Above the stones, a wooden hopper fed the grain. From here the kernels descended steadily, shaken into place by a small device known as the shoe, which trembled rhythmically as the stones turned. The flow had to be carefully regulated. Too little, and the stones ground against each other uselessly. Too much, and the flour emerged coarse and unrefined. Thus the miller listened constantly to the pitch of the grinding, adjusting levers and wedges to keep balance. The architecture of the mill was not only mechanical but atmospheric. Light filtered dimly through chinks, illuminating motes of flour dust. The soundscape was layered. The thud of sacks dropped onto the floor, the shuffle of feet, the steady groan of gears, the low hiss of stone upon stone. Outside, water murmured through the channel, endlessly diverted from its natural course into the service of human hunger. Inside, all was dust and wood, stone and motion. Windmills, which appeared in Europe a little later than watermills, offered a different architectural profile but a similar interior logic. Tall, often tower-like, their sails caught the prevailing winds and transferred power inward through horizontal shafts and gears. Climbing into a windmill meant ascending narrow wooden stairs, winding upward past great beams and rotating mechanisms. The sound here was sharper than in watermills, the whoosh of wind through the sails, the sudden creaks as gusts pressed harder, the rhythmic clatter of gears engaging. From the outside, the sails moved with deceptive calm. From within, one felt the strain of timber under pressure, the building alive with motion. Whether watermill or windmill, the structure was always functional, rarely beautiful in any conventional sense. Yet, in its functionality, lay a kind of austere grace. Every timber, every gear, every stone had a purpose. Nothing was idle, nothing decorative beyond what was necessary to protect and sustain the mechanism. The mill's beauty was that of endurance, of repetition, of work performed without cease. To walk through the architecture of a medieval mill, then, is to walk through a microcosm of rural life. Here was the river harnessed, the wind captured, the stone quarried, the timber shaped, all converging in a single place where the raw gift of the field became the daily bread of the household. The mill house was both building and machine, both shelter and tool, a place where natural elements and human craft met in endless motion. For the villagers who came to it, the architecture mattered less than its result. Yet for the miller, who lived within its creaks and dust, who knew the timbers by their groans and the stones by their sounds, the building was almost alive, a companion as much as a workplace. Its walls held the memory of countless grindings, its stones wore down as slowly as lifetimes. The architecture of the mill was not designed to impress but to endure, and in enduring to feed. To understand the life of the miller is to enter a world where hours are measured, not by clocks or bells alone, but by the turning of wheels, the flow of water, and the endless hum of stone upon stone. His work was not dramatic, and it offered little variety, yet it was indispensable. Each day unfolded with small careful tasks, repeated with the patience of someone who knew that food, and thus life itself, depended on the mill's quiet continuity. The morning often began early, well before the first villagers appeared with their sacks of grain. The miller would step into the mill house, its timbers cool with dew, and take in the faint smell of damp wood mixed with flour dust. Before anything else, he inspected the wheel. The water's flow could never be taken for granted. Overnight rains might have swelled the stream, threatening to flood the channel and strain the paddles, or drought might have slowed the current, leaving the wheel sluggish. He walked the mill race, noting weeds or silt that could impede the water's movement, clearing debris with a forked branch or his hands. A mill was not an isolated machine. It was bound intimately to the river, and every change in the river found its echo in the wheel. Returning inside, the miller checked the gearing. Wooden teeth, shaped by hand and worn by constant contact, had to be examined for splinters or breaks. A cracked cog could jam the whole system, and repairing it required laborious carving of replacements. The miller kept a small stock of spares, each shaped with care, waiting for its inevitable call to service. He listened as he turned the gears by hand, the creak and thump revealing whether they were still meshing smoothly. To most villagers, the machinery was mysterious. To the miller it spoke in familiar tones, each sound a message about its condition. Then came the stones. The runner and bedstone were immense, but they required delicacy in their care. Stones wore unevenly, their furrows dulled by use. Every so often they had to be dressed with a pick, the grooves recut to sharpen the grinding surface. It was back-breaking work, lifting the runner stone from its place with a simple crane of wood and rope, then spending hours crouched over its surface, chipping patiently. But this was not a daily task, rather it was a ritual of weeks or months. On ordinary mornings, the miller leaned close, listening to the stones as they turned, adjusting the gap between them with a wooden lever. Too close, and the flour scorched, filling the air with the smell of burnt grain. Too far apart, and the meal emerged coarse, displeasing to the villagers who depended on it. A miller's ear became finely tuned to this music of stone, able to hear in its pitch whether the grind was too harsh or too loose. By the time the villagers began to arrive, the mill was ready. They came in slow procession, often in pairs or small groups, carrying sacks of barley, rye, oats or wheat upon their backs, or loaded upon carts and donkeys. The grain was heavy, the sacks stiff with chaff dust, and their arrival always filled the mill house with the faint rustling sound of shifting kernels. The miller received them with the same routine, weighing the grain, noting the measure, explaining how much flour would be returned after the process, and how much would remain as his fee. Suspicion often lingered in the air. Villagers watched closely, wary of any trick, though the truth was often more mundane. The yield of flour depended heavily on the quality and dryness of the grain itself. Still, the miller carried a reputation for slyness, and each exchange was a ritual of mistrust and necessity. Once the grain was tipped into the hopper, the slow work resumed. The shoe trembled, feeding kernels into the eye of the stones. Flour emerged gradually, soft dust falling into the meal chest below, where it was scooped into sacks and tied shut with rough twine. It was repetitive work, and yet each batch required attention. Grain varied by season, by field, by weather. Moist kernels clogged and resisted grinding, Overly dry grain produced finer flour, but strained the stones. The miller's eyes and ears were never idle. Between loads, he tended to maintenance. Axle grease had to be applied to keep wooden shafts from seizing. Leaks in the mill race were patched with clay or straw. Rats were a constant enemy, drawn to the smell of grain. Traps were set, and cats were sometimes kept to patrol the corners. Dust itself, fine and pale, settled on every surface, coating beams, gears, and even the miller's own hair and clothes, until he seemed almost like a figure of flour himself. Too much dust was dangerous. It could ignite in sudden flashes if a spark appeared, so shutters were opened, and ventilation kept the air moving, however imperfectly. The rhythm of the day was long, stretching with the turning of the wheel. Harvest time was the busiest, the mill house crowded with villagers waiting their turn, the wheel turning from dawn until dusk. At quieter seasons, the miller might spend more time repairing timbers, sharpening tools, or simply waiting for customers. Yet even in stillness, the mill was never entirely silent. Water gurgled through the channel, gears creaked faintly as they settled, the stones shifted minutely in their wooden frames. The miller lived within a constant background of sound, as familiar as breathing. As the sun declined, the last sacks were collected, villagers trudging back to their cottages with flour for the next day's bread. The miller swept the floor, gathered stray kernels, and checked the machinery once more before easing the wheel to a halt, raising the sluice to let the water bypass the paddles. Evening descended slowly. The mill house darkened, shadows lengthened across beams and walls, and the day's dust settled quietly upon the floor. It was not a life of grandeur. The miller's work was heavy, repetitive, and often thankless. Yet in its ordinariness lay its importance. Without his daily ritual, checking the water, maintaining the gears, tending the stones, the village could not eat. Bread was life, and bread depended on flour, and flour depended on the miller. He was no hero, no figure of romance, but an intermediary between nature and necessity, his days measured by the steady hum of stone and the unending flow of water. Thus, the daily ritual of the miller became a quiet heartbeat in the life of the village, unseen, uncelebrated, but essential, turning endlessly like the wheel outside his door. In the daily life of the mill, it was not the stones, nor even the wheel, that most defined the experience, but the grain itself, the humble harvest of fields that made their way, season after season, into the dark interior of the mill house. Every sack that crossed the threshold carried more than kernels. It carried the labor of plowmen, the rhythm of the seasons, the anxieties of weather, and the hope of bread. For the miller, who spent his days surrounded by these coarse sacks, the grain was both burden and lifeblood, its weight a constant reminder of the community's dependence on him and on the wheel that turned outside. The sacks themselves were heavy, woven from rough linen or hemp, their surfaces stiff with chaff dust and faintly scratchy to the touch. They were usually patched, mended repeatedly by thrifty hands, since a good sack might serve a family for many years. Carried on shoulders, dragged in carts, or slung across the backs of donkeys, they arrived at the mill in slow procession, each groaning with the weight of a family's hopes. The miller knew these sacks intimately, for he lifted them, shifted them, stacked them against the walls of the mill house. Each one pressed upon his back and arms, reminding him of the sheer heaviness of the harvest transformed into flour. The grain inside spoke of the land that bore it. Wheat was prized above all, for it yielded the whitest, finest flour, and thus the most desirable bread. Its kernels were plump, smooth and pale, glinting faintly golden in the light. Rye, darker and denser, carried the smell of earth, and when ground, its flour produced heavy loaves that kept longer, but lacked the softness of wheat bread. Barley, with its rough husks, often went into porridge or coarse bread, filling stomachs but never celebrated for delicacy. Oats, common in northern regions, lent themselves as much to gruel as to flour, their flavor hearty and plain. Each sack that entered the mill house announced its content in the faint scent it gave off, a mingling of sweetness, dampness and dust. The miller handled grain with practiced familiarity. He could tell by touch whether kernels were too damp from rain, a dangerous quality that clogged the stones and threatened to rot if left too long. He knew by weight whether the sack was full to measure. by sound, whether the kernels shifted loosely or clumped together. He dipped his hand into the sacks, letting the kernels slide through his fingers, a small waterfall of harvest that felt cool, dry, and strangely alive with the memory of the field. The villagers often thought only of the flour to come, but the miller thought of the grain as it was now, raw and untransformed, its potential not yet fulfilled. As the grain passed from sack to hopper, its journey continued with a steady inevitability. The hopper, triangular and plain, held the kernels until they slipped down into the trembling shoe which guided them into the central eye of the stones. There was something ceremonial in this descent, or what had been gathered under sun and sky, bound into sheaves, threshed on barn floors, and stored in lofts, now made its final passage into the dark embrace of stone. Each kernel disappeared without trace, its individuality lost in the greater mass, its form ground into dust. The miller observed this, not with sentiment, but with patient acceptance. It was the way of things. Grain existed to be ground, and his task was to see it done properly. The weight of grain was not only physical but symbolic. It carried the economy of the village, for in every sack lay obligations and fees. Part of the flour remained with the miller as payment. Another portion was sometimes owed to the lord of the manor or to the monastery that owned the mill. Grain was also tithed to the church, a 10th portion claimed as divine due. Thus, when a villager carried his sack to the mill house, he carried not only food for his family, but the invisible hands of lord, church, and miller already reaching into it. The miller felt this in each measure he made, the grain slipping from community possession into shared, divided streams of obligation. There was also memory in the grain. Each harvest carried echoes of the year that produced it, whether rains had been too heavy, whether sun had been too weak, whether pests had infested the years before threshing. A poor harvest meant lighter sacks, meager flour, thinner bread. The miller handling grain each season became an unofficial chronicler of agricultural fortune. He could recall the abundance of one year by the heaviness of the sacks, the hunger of another by their half-filled emptiness. His memory was measured not in dates or chronicles, but in the texture of kernels and the flour they yielded. For the villagers, the moment when a sack was returned filled with flour carried a quiet reassurance. The weight was lighter now, but its promise was greater. Flour, though softer and dustier, was the substance of bread, and bread meant life. The transition from grain to flour was a transformation felt as much as seen. The sack that had pressed down heavily on the back now swung more easily in hand, yet it carried the promise of meals, of nourishment, of survival through winter nights. The weight of grain thus changed into the weight of bread, redistributed across tables and hearths. Inside the mill house, however, the grain left its traces. Chaff gathered in corners, kernels rolled loose on the floorboards, flour dust coated beams, gears, and the miller's very skin. The air was never entirely free of it. Fine particles catching in throats, settling into hair, sifting onto clothing, until everything seemed faintly ghost-like. The miller bore this dust as his second skin, his very presence marked by it in the village. To see him walking home in the evening, pale-coated with flour, was to see the embodiment of the grain itself, carried outward from the mill. In the end, the weight of grain was more than the sum of its kernels. It was the condensation of labor from field to threshing floor, the measure of a household's survival, the burden carried to the mill, and the sustenance carried back. It was both heavy and light, physical and symbolic, ordinary and sacred. For the miller who touched it daily, it was simply constant. The endless flow of sacks, the endless sound of kernels sliding, the endless transformation of weight into dust, season after season, year after year. To step into the mill house was to enter not only a space of labor and dust, but also a world of sound. It was never silent, never still, for even when the wheel outside turned lazily, or the grindstones slowed to a halt, echoes lingered in the timbers, and in the ears of those who lived near it. The mill was, above all, an instrument. Wood, stone, and water combined into a steady music that accompanied village life, its rhythms as reliable as the toll of a church bell or the crow of a cock at dawn. The first note of this soundscape came from the water itself. For those who lived near a watermill, the constant rush of the stream or river was the background hum of existence. Water spilled over weirs, surged through leats, and struck the great wheel with a force that was both gentle and inexorable. The wheel turned with a slow groan, each bucket or paddle catching and releasing water in steady succession. It was a rhythm without haste, a turning that seemed to measure time more patiently than any clock could. For those who fell asleep to its murmur, the sound of the water wheel became inseparable from the passage of days and seasons. Once inside, the sound grew denser, layered with the workings of timber and stone. The great axle, thick and worn, rotated with a muted rumble, its weight borne on wooden bearings that moaned softly under the strain. The cogs of the pit wheel, meshing with those of the wallower, gave off a clicking cadence, a subdued percussion that never quite lost its irregularity. Each tooth of wood struck another with a dull thud, softened by age, yet precise enough to keep the stones turning. Above, the vertical shaft rose like a humming spine, carrying motion upward into the upper floors. It trembled faintly with the effort, and when one laid a hand against it, one could feel the vibration resonate through bone. Around it, pulleys and ropes creaked as they lifted sacks, each movement punctuated by the sigh of hemp fibers strained under weight. Nothing within the mill was silent. Even the stationary beams creaked faintly as the structure settled and adjusted to the turning within. Then came the most important sound of all, the grindstones. Their rotation was not quick, but heavy, each revolution producing a low, continuous drone. Grain poured into their eye with a faint patter, like dry rain falling into earth. As the kernels were caught between stone surfaces, the grinding began, a subdued roar, granular and rough, a sound both monotonous and strangely soothing. It was the music of transformation, the noise of sustenance being made from harvest. Flour dust rose in answer, but sound was always the first sign that the stones were doing their work. This grinding was accompanied by smaller notes, the almost imperceptible rasp of stone against stone as millers adjusted the gap, the occasional clack when a foreign pebble or hardened kernel resisted too long. These minor disruptions did not disturb the rhythm, but only reminded listeners that this was a living soundscape, never fully mechanical, always bound to the irregularities of nature and craft. Surrounding the heart of the mill's music were the incidental sounds that completed the composition: the shuffle of feet on wooden floors, the dragging thump of sacks being hauled or dropped, the snort of a donkey waiting outside, the muffled chatter of villagers waiting their turn, all blended into the mill's atmosphere. Even the flour dust had its own sound, a faint hiss as it sifted down from cloths or drifted when a sack was shaken open. For children, visiting the mill could feel like stepping into a world of restless, invisible voices, each beam and gear contributing to a vast, unending conversation. Beyond the mill house, the sound extended outward. The water wheels splashing echoed along the river banks, mingling with birdsong, the rustle of reeds, the distant lowing of cattle. A windmill, in contrast, carried its sound across fields, the creak of sails pivoting on their great timbers, the groan of turning machinery, and the sigh of wind caught and released. To villagers working in the fields, these noises marked the presence of labor ongoing, a reassurance that while they bent to reap or sow, the mill was already at work transforming what had been gathered. For the miller himself, these sounds were more than background. They were signals, guides, warnings. The pitch of the grinding told him whether the stones were set too wide or too close. A sudden unevenness in the cog's rhythm warned of a tooth about to give way. The volume of the water wheel's groan revealed whether the flow was strong enough or needed adjustment. He listened constantly, his ear as attuned to the machinery as his eye was to the grain. For him the soundscape was not only atmospheric but essential, a map of his labor written in noise. Yet, over time, these sounds became a kind of comfort. The groan of wood, the splash of water, the drone of stones, all spoke of continuity. Villagers knew, as they approached the mill along the path, that its voice carried across the fields. To hear it was to know that flour was being made, that bread would be baked, that life continued in its slow and steady course. Even when storms broke the wheel or drought silenced the stream, villagers missed not only the service but the sound, for its absence was a wound in the daily music of the countryside. If one stood in the mill at dusk, When the last sacks had been ground and the stones were allowed to slow, the soundscape faded like a receding tide. The drone diminished to a hum. The cogs slowed their clicks. The water wheel groaned with less urgency. Silence did not arrive suddenly but seeped in gradually, like evening shadows. Only then could one appreciate how saturated the day had been with sound. The mill, when still, felt uncanny, as though it had lost its voice, waiting only for dawn and the return of water, grain and labor to set its symphony in motion again. The soundscape of the mill, then, was not only noise but memory. It imprinted itself on those who lived near it. Children who grew up hearing its drone, elders who measured years by the constancy of its wheel. Even centuries later, when ruins stand silent by riversides or windmills turn only as museum pieces, visitors sometimes claim to hear faint echoes, the imagined groan of wood, the whisper of stones, the splash of water. Whether real or remembered, the sound lingers, a ghost of labor that once gave voice to the survival of countless villages. If the mill was the heart of rural life, then the villagers' arrival with their grain was the steady pulse that gave it meaning. Day after day, season after season, the paths that led to the mill became well worn by feet, hooves, and wheels, as families brought their harvest in slow procession. It was not a dramatic event, not a grand occasion, but a familiar ritual, repeated so often that it seemed to fold into the rhythm of life itself. Yet in this quiet flow of people, one could see the dependence of an entire community upon the turning stones and upon the miller who tended them. In autumn, after the harvest had been gathered and threshed, the procession was at its busiest. Families made their way from distant farmsteads, carrying sacks of wheat, rye, barley, or oats, depending on what the year had yielded. The paths to the mill filled with carts drawn by oxen or donkeys, with men bent under the weight of sacks on their shoulders, and with women and children following close behind. Children often carried smaller bundles, their arms wrapped tightly around bags that seemed oversized for their bodies. Their steps were slower, their breathing heavy, but their pride evident. They were part of the chain that carried the harvest to its final transformation. The arrival was rarely loud. Villagers did not come to the mill expecting cheer or spectacle. Instead, there was a subdued murmur of voices, the occasional grunt of effort, the creak of wooden cart wheels, the snort of an animal tugging its load. The closer they came to the mill, the more they heard the familiar sound of the wheel turning and the stones grinding, blending with the cadence of their approach. To hear those sounds before entering was to be reassured. The mill was alive, the work was ongoing, and soon their own grain would join the flow. At the threshold of the mill house, the sacks were set down with thumps, the dust of grain rising faintly into the air. The miller greeted them, not always warmly, but with a steadiness born of routine. His hands reached for the sacks, lifting, testing their weight, judging their contents with the practiced ease of one who had handled thousands. Transactions were made quietly, grain noted, payment arrangements implied or spoken softly. Sometimes it was coin, sometimes a portion of the flour, sometimes obligations tied to lord or monastery. Each family knew the rules, and the miller, though often regarded with suspicion, stood as an unavoidable intermediary between harvest and bread. Children, meanwhile, wandered about the edges, peering curiously at the mill machinery, watching the wheel turn, tracing with their fingers the trails of flour dust that coated the beams. For them, the mill was not only a workplace, but a place of wonder. They felt the vibration of the stones beneath their feet, listened to the grinding drone, and marveled at the transformation of kernels into powder. The procession was both labor and education, a passing on of familiarity with the tools of survival. There were moments of quiet exchange among villagers too. While waiting their turn, neighbors spoke of weather, livestock, or small matters of the season. The mill thus became, in a subdued way, a gathering point, not a marketplace with shouts and noise, but a subdued forum, where voices mingled with the drone of the stones and the splashing of the wheel. Friendships were maintained here, grievances whispered, bargains struck. For many, the mill was not simply the place where grain was ground, but where communal ties were renewed, softly and without ceremony. The procession had its own rhythm across the year. After autumn's busyness, The winter saw fewer arrivals, but still steady. Grain stored in lofts or granaries was brought as needed, especially when snow and cold pressed families to bake more heavily. In spring, with fields newly sown, the pace slowed further, but it never stopped entirely. By summer, before the next harvest, the grain supplies dwindled, and families often arrived with lighter sacks, their stores nearly exhausted, their reliance on the mill sharpened by necessity. Thus, the flow of people mirrored the agricultural calendar, and the miller came to know the season not by the tilt of the sun alone, but by the pattern of visitors. On feast days or holy days, the procession could pause, for villagers respected the calendar of the church as much as the demands of their stomachs. Yet even then, one might see a lone figure making the walk to the mill, a sack slung across a shoulder, unwilling to delay the grinding of grain when hunger pressed. The mill was in this sense immune to complete rest. It responded to need, not merely to ritual. For the miller, the villager's procession was both reassuring and burdensome. It meant work, the endless lifting and grinding, but it also meant continuity. As long as people came with sacks, as long as the paths bore footprints and cart tracks, the mill had purpose. Without the villagers, the stones would fall silent, the wheel would stagnate, and the mill house would become no more than an empty shell by the river or on the hill. Thus, in their steady arrival, he saw proof that his labor, however mistrusted, was indispensable. The image of the procession remained etched into the memory of those who lived it. Families recalled trudging to the mill with their fathers or grandfathers, remembered the heft of the sacks, the smell of grain, the hum of the stones. When, in later centuries, mills declined or stood abandoned, it was the absence of this procession that struck villagers most. The path grew overgrown, the wheel stilled, and silence fell where once the steady murmur of human and mill had intertwined. The memory of the procession lingered, a ghost of continuity lost with the advance of time. Though the mill was first and foremost a place of labor, where grain became flour and sustenance was secured, its role in the life of the village stretched further than its wooden walls and groaning wheels. It became, through repetition and necessity, a quiet anchor for social life, not a marketplace filled with stalls and shouts, nor a church resounding with bells and sermons, but a subtler center, a place where lives intersected, where conversations lingered, and where the invisible bonds of dependence and familiarity were strengthened with each turning of the wheel. The arrival of villagers with their sacks of grain brought together people who otherwise might remain apart in their fields and cottages. Farmers who lived at opposite ends of the parish met at the mill while waiting for their flour. Women exchanged news of births, marriages, or illnesses as they leaned against the cool stone walls, flour dust drifting about them. Children, restless and curious, formed their own small circles of play, chasing each other between carts or drawing lines in the flour scattered across the floorboards. The mill was not designed as a gathering place, but the slowness of its work made waiting inevitable, and in that waiting, a kind of community wove itself together. It was here that the gossip of the village often found its surest footing. News spread along the road, through the tavern, or after Sunday Mass. But at the mill it lingered, repeated and embroidered, while sacks shifted and stones groaned. Who had brought in a poor yield? Who had been seen lingering too long in another's company? Whose debts had grown unmanageable? The miller, standing nearby, overheard much of this talk, though he rarely joined in. He became both participant and silent witness to the currents of his community's life, his reputation shaped as much by rumor as by reality. The mill also served in its way as a site of exchange. While coin could pay for grinding, barter was common. A portion of flour, a measure of grain, or even small goods might be left in settlement of a debt. Sometimes, deals were struck among villagers themselves as they waited. The promise of assistance in harvest, a trade of eggs for cloth, an agreement to share tools. The mill thus became a node in the network of rural economy, not only through the grinding of grain, but through the weaving of agreements. More subtly still, the mill was a reminder of mutual dependence. No family could live without bread, and no family could grind all its grain by hand once fields grew large enough to yield surplus. The mill was a communal necessity, a shared reliance upon the labor of the miller and the mechanism of the wheel. However mistrusted the miller might be, accused of skimming a handful, of setting his tolls unfairly, the fact remained that no household could escape him. This interdependence bred both resentment and recognition, tying the fates of the villagers together through the rhythmic sound of grinding stones. In times of poor harvest, this sense of shared fate deepened. When sacks grew lighter and loaves grew smaller, the conversations at the mill were hushed with worry. Villagers measured their prospects against one another, comparing the yield of fields, whispering about whether stores would last through the winter. The mill, in these moments, became a place not only of work, but of shared anxiety, its stones grinding out the meager flour of a difficult year. Yet, in times of abundance, the mood shifted. The mill filled with laughter, with surplus traded, with the satisfaction of heavy sacks and fine flour. Children received scraps of bread or handfuls of coarse meal to chew as they waited, their mouths dusted white like miniature millers. The social anchor of the mill was not one of celebration or spectacle, but of continuity, of sharing in both fortune and hardship. The church was the place where villagers met God, and the marketplace was where they met strangers, but the mill was where they met one another in the ordinary persistence of daily survival. It was not a place one visited for pleasure, but for necessity, and yet that necessity brought people together more reliably than any festival. Each family's presence at the mill was proof of life continuing. Grain harvested, bread baked, another season endured. Over the centuries, these gatherings left their mark, not in grand chronicles, but in the memory of rural communities. Folk tales grew around mills, not only about the millers, but about the gatherings at their doors, the quarrels, the agreements, the whispered scandals. When later generations passed abandoned mills, they remembered not only the hum of the wheel, but the hum of voices that once surrounded it. In this way, the mill was never only a mechanism but a living social space, its role in the community as enduring as its stones. Among all the parts of the mill, none bore the burden of labor with such constancy as the stones. Wooden cogs could be replaced, shafts could be mended, ropes could be spliced, and wheels could be rebuilt when rot or storm claimed them. But the stones themselves, once chosen, once shaped, remained at the heart of the mill for generations. They were the silent workers, faceless and voiceless, yet more essential than the miller himself. They had no need of food, no demand for rest, and no complaint against the endless grain poured upon them. Their only answer was the patient, grinding turn, a motion so steady and enduring that it became invisible in its familiarity. The story of a millstone began long before it ever touched a kernel of wheat. It began in quarries, often far from the villages where the mills stood. Certain regions became famous for their stone, the porous, sharp-grained burrstones of the Seine Valley in France, the tough gritstone of Derbyshire in England, the lava stones of Germany's Eifel region. Each had qualities prized by millers: porosity that allowed air to flow and prevented overheating, hardness that kept an edge across years of use, a texture fine enough to cut grain without turning it to dust. Men cut these stones from living rock with hammers and chisels, sweating in quarries that echoed with the sound of metal striking stone. Great discs were hewn, shaped with painstaking labor, for each would weigh hundreds of pounds, sometimes even a ton. The transport of these stones was an undertaking of its own. Teams of oxen dragged them overland on carts, reinforced for the purpose. Rivers carried them on barges, their weight pressing low into the water. Villagers waited weeks or months for their arrival, for without stones a mill was silent. When at last they arrived, they were hauled into the mill house with ropes and pulleys, a slow and dangerous task, each movement measured, for the loss of control meant broken stone and wasted labor. Once installed, the stones were not smooth but carefully dressed. Millwrights cut grooves into their surfaces, furrows radiating outward in patterns designed to catch grain and guide it inward. These grooves were not decoration but craft, the very art of milling written in stone. Their arrangement determined how efficiently grain was ground, how fine or coarse the flour became, and how well the stones cooled as they turned. Dressing a stone was a task repeated across its lifetime. Every few months the grooves wore down under the ceaseless grinding, and had to be recut by hand with iron picks. The miller or a skilled stone dresser would kneel beside the heavy disc, striking carefully to renew the pattern. Sparks sometimes flew, and dust rose thick in the air, coating skin and lungs. It was patient, monotonous work, but necessary, for dull stones yielded poor flour and wasted grain. When the stones turned in motion, their patience became visible. One stone, the bedstone, lay still and solid, sunk into the foundation of the mill house, immovable as the earth itself. Above it rested the runner stone, suspended on a spindle, turning with the force carried up from wheel and gear. Grain slipped between them, vanishing into the narrow gap, and emerged transformed into flour. The stones never ceased their slow embrace, one fixed, the other restless, together creating the substance that sustained life. The sound they made was low and resonant, a hum that spoke of weight and endurance. Villagers often recognized the health of the mill by this sound. Too loud, and the stones were set too close, grinding themselves rather than the grain. Too faint, and the stones lay too far apart, leaving kernels unbroken. But when the sound was steady and even, it was the very voice of patience, the song of stone fulfilling its purpose. The life of a millstone stretched across generations. A good pair might serve for decades, even a century, if carefully tended and regularly dressed. They wore slowly, particle by particle, ground down by their own labor, yet their wearing was not waste but transformation, for as they gave themselves away they yielded flour in return. The patience of the stone was measured not in years, but in the countless meals it enabled, in the endless loaves baked, in the survival of winters that would have been hungrier without its service. The miller lived his life in rhythm with the stones. He knew their voices, their temperaments, their flaws. He adjusted their distance with wooden wedges, listened for the faintest change in pitch, felt their heat with the back of his hand. He trusted them more than he trusted neighbors, for the stones never lied. They either ground or they did not. They either turned smoothly, or they faltered. He might be accused of dishonesty or greed, but the stones bore no blame. They were impartial, grinding every sack that came before them with the same unyielding patience. The villagers too came to associate their lives with the stones. To bring grain to the mill was to surrender it to this timeless process, to place trust in the faceless discs hidden within the mill house. They rarely saw the stones directly, dust and machinery obscured them, but they felt their presence in the flour that returned, in the bread that emerged from ovens, in the strength that filled their bodies. The stones, though unseen, were constant companions in every household. Their patience translated into nourishment. Over centuries, stones wore away, their grooves grew shallow, their surfaces thinned, and eventually they cracked under the strain. When this happened, they were replaced, but never forgotten. Old stones were sometimes set outside mill houses, repurposed as thresholds, tables, or markers. Even in silence, they bore testimony to their long patience, their surfaces still faintly traced with grooves worn by generations of grain. Travelers sometimes stumbled upon them in fields or villages, half buried in earth, relics of mills long vanished. Their presence was a reminder that the patience of stone outlasted the lives of millers, villagers, and even the mills themselves. The patience of the millstone also carried a deeper symbolism. Stone, born of the earth, carved by human hands, harnessed by water or wind, embodied the balance between nature and labor. Its turning was both mechanical and elemental, a union of earth, air, and water. In folklore, stones were sometimes granted voices or spirits, imagined to turn even when no hand set them in motion. Their patience seemed unnatural, uncanny, as though they carried within them a will of endurance. Tales spoke of haunted mills where stones turned at night, grinding phantom grain for unseen customers. Such stories, though fanciful, testified to the awe with which people regarded these patient discs. When mills declined in later centuries, replaced by steam engines and iron rollers, the old stones seemed relics of another age, yet their patience still impressed those who saw them, their sheer weight and size reminding viewers of the slow endurance that once sustained whole communities. Museums and restorations preserved them, not only as curiosities, but as symbols of the quiet persistence of pre-industrial life. Their grooves, worn and shallow, still whispered of centuries of grinding, of uncountable meals, of lives lived in their shadow. In the end, the patience of the millstone is a metaphor for history itself. Like the stone, history turns slowly, wearing down individuals, yet yielding sustenance for those who live within its flow. It does not hurry, does not rest, does not complain. It simply continues, heavy and enduring, grinding the kernels of time into the flour of memory. The miller may die, the village may vanish, the mill may crumble, but the patience of the stone remains, echoing in every fragment left behind. The life of the village mill was not steady in the way that the stones themselves were steady. Though the runner stone turned with patient consistency whenever grain was poured into its hollow, the flow of water that powered it, the harvests that supplied it, and the conditions of the year all altered its rhythm. Unlike the baker who rose each morning with fire and dough, the miller had to listen to the seasons. He stood at the boundary where human labor met natural cycles, adapting his work to the whims of rivers, skies, and fields. In the spring, when the snows melted on higher ground and rains fell steadily, rivers swelled and streams ran quick. For the watermill, this was both a blessing and a hazard. Strong currents promised abundant power, enough to turn the wheel with force, perhaps even too much force. The miller adjusted sluices carefully, opening or narrowing them to regulate the water's rush. At times the flood was so great that the wheel spun dangerously fast, straining shafts and cogs with a violence that threatened to crack them. Villagers saw in these swollen streams both the renewal of the earth and the peril of destruction, for floods might wash away bridges, drown fields, or damage the very mill on which they depended. The miller spent long hours during spring's height, watching the water, standing by with poles and levers to clear branches, stones and other debris swept into the channel. He did not simply grind grain, he guarded the delicate balance between the river's generosity and its fury. Summer brought a change of rhythm. The rivers shrank under the heat, their waters slowed, and sometimes in years of drought, they dwindled to trickles. In such times the water wheel turned sluggishly, and the miller faced the frustration of stillness. His skill could not summon water where none flowed. Villagers, carrying sacks of grain, might find the mill silent, its wheel motionless, the stones idle in their sockets. In desperation, some turned to hand querns, dusting off the old circular stones kept for such emergencies, grinding enough flour to keep households fed. For the miller, the summer drought was not just a technical problem, but a test of patience. He maintained the machinery, oiled gears and checked beams, waiting for the rains to return. His work was no longer the constant hum of grinding, but the slow upkeep of readiness, like a farmer tending fields that would not yet yield. When autumn came, the rhythm shifted once more, and this was the mill's true season. Harvest time brought villagers in procession, laden with grain from the fields. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat came in carts, on donkeys, on the backs of men and women. The mill, often quiet in the lean summer months, now rang with life. The wheel turned steadily day and night, stones grinding ceaselessly to meet demand. Dust filled the air, settling on rafters, on the miller's clothes, on the hair of children who came to watch. The sound of the stones became the background pulse of the village. Steady as a heartbeat, long lines of villagers waited their turn, exchanging news, gossip, and weary glances as the harvest was slowly transformed into flour. Autumn was also a time of reckoning. The miller collected his toll in grain, a handful from each sack, payment for his labor, and the upkeep of the mill. This toll fed his family, supplied his own table, and in some places became a source of contention, for villagers were watchful and suspicious of dishonesty. Yet for all the suspicion, they returned again and again, for they had no choice. The rhythm of the mill and the rhythm of the harvest were bound tightly together, each autumn weaving the community into a cycle of dependence on the turning stones. Winter, however, was the season of silence. The cold locked rivers under ice, froze sluices, and stilled wheels. Mills stood empty, their stones dusted with frost instead of flour. Sometimes the miller worked indoors, sharpening tools, repairing broken cogs, and preparing for spring. He stored grain carefully to prevent damp or rats from spoiling it, for winter hunger was always near. Villagers, too, shifted their rhythm. They baked bread from flour ground in the months before, rationing their stores carefully. In some places, hand querns returned to use, brought close to the hearth where warmth softened the work. The stillness of winter was not merely mechanical, it entered the lives of all, a slowing down of the pulse that had quickened in autumn. For the miller, the cycle of seasons became a measure of life itself. Each year repeated the same pattern: spring floods, summer droughts, autumn abundance, winter stillness, but no year was entirely the same. Some springs brought gentle rains, others violent floods. Some summers were merciful, others dry and merciless. Some harvests were plentiful, some thin. Each year carved its memory into the stones of the mill, not visibly, but in the stories told by villagers, in the weariness of the miller's hands, in the careful adjustments of sluices and gears. The seasonality of milling connected the craft deeply to agriculture, unlike blacksmiths or carpenters, whose work was steady throughout the year. The miller shared the farmer's dependence on the harvest, the weather, and the land. He did not till fields or scatter seed, yet his livelihood rose and fell with the same cycles. In this way, the mill became a symbol of the agricultural year, its turning wheel echoing the turning of the seasons, its stones reflecting the endurance required of those who lived close to the land. Even in later centuries, when larger mills with reservoirs and dams were built to store water and even out the flow across seasons, the old rhythm remained in memory. People still spoke of flood years, drought years, lean winters, and fat harvests. The mill's dependence on nature could never be entirely conquered, for even with improvements, a dry summer still meant weaker power, and a frozen river still meant delay. The seasons wrote themselves into the very identity of milling, so much so that to speak of a mill was often to speak of its place in the natural cycle of the year. In this rhythm, patience became the miller's greatest virtue. He could not force the water to flow or the grain to ripen. He could only prepare, maintain, and wait, knowing that the seasons would turn as they always had, as they always would. The floods of spring, the droughts of summer, the harvests of autumn, the freezes of winter. Each was both challenge and gift, each carried both hardship and sustenance. And through it all, the mill stood quietly, its stones waiting for the next sack of grain, its wheel waiting for the next rush of water, its beams creaking with the slow passage of time. Thus the seasons shaped not only the pace of milling, but the very character of the village itself. To live in the shadow of the mill was to live within the turning of the year, to measure time not only by saints' days and festivals, but by floods, droughts, harvests, and freezes. The mill was a calendar in motion, its stones marking time as surely as any church bell, and just as the patience of the stones endured across decades, so too did the patience of the community endure, trusting each year that the seasons, however harsh, would once more complete their circle. If the patience of the stones was the foundation of the mill, then the knowledge of the miller was its guiding hand. The stones did not set themselves, the wheel did not adjust its own flow, and the sacks of grain did not leap from cart to chute. A mill could stand with all its timbers firm, its cogs sound, and its wheel well fed with water, but without the miller's knowledge, the labor would yield only waste. His craft was not loud, not spectacular, and rarely celebrated, but it was essential. It consisted of careful observation, slow adjustments, and years of apprenticeship in the quiet hum of the mill house. At the heart of this knowledge lay the grain itself. Every sack brought to the mill was slightly different. Some were filled with barley, husked and coarse, destined for animal feed or rough bread. Others contained wheat, finer and more prized, with kernels varying in size and hardness. Rye, darker and resilient, carried its own weight of history, often the grain of choice in regions where wheat would not grow. Oats came softer, with a husky aroma, requiring a gentle hand, lest they be ground to meal too fine to cook well. The miller learned to know them by touch, by smell, and even by the faint sound they made when poured from sack to bin. Moisture was the hidden element, invisible, but crucial. Grain that was too wet clogged the grooves of the stones, producing paste rather than flour. Too dry, and it shattered into dust, yielding bitter, uneven meal. The miller tested moisture with his hands, taking a fistful and pressing it, listening for the faint crackle of dry kernels, feeling the give of damp ones. There were no instruments, no scales of precision. His senses became the measure, honed across years until he could judge at a glance what needed adjustment. Adjustment was the second layer of his craft. The stones, though patient, did not grind without guidance. Their gap had to be set carefully, wider for coarser meal, narrower for fine flour. Wooden wedges and iron screws allowed the miller to raise or lower the runner stone by fractions, changes almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but vital to the outcome. He listened for the sound of the stones in motion. Too close and they screeched, sparking heat that scorched the grain. Too far, and kernels passed through half-broken, wasting labor. He listened in a way that villagers rarely understood, the hum of stone on stone becoming a kind of language, known only to those who spent their days beside it. The flow of grain was also his to regulate. If poured too quickly, it smothered the stones, clogging their furrows. Too slowly, and the stones turned idle, their power wasted. The miller watched the hopper above the stones, a wooden funnel feeding the grain downward, and adjusted the little stick called the shoe, tapping it to keep the stream steady. This rhythm was small, unnoticed by villagers who saw only flour in sacks, but it was the rhythm that kept the mill alive. Power itself was never constant. Water rose and fell with the seasons. Wind gusted and faltered with the hour. The miller adjusted the sluices to control the water's force, guiding more or less into the wheel's paddles depending on need. In windmills, he trimmed sails or shifted their angle to catch or ease the wind. This was not done once but continually, for nature did not keep steady pace. A storm could rise suddenly, turning the wheel too fast and threatening to break gears, or the air could still, leaving the sails lifeless. The miller's knowledge was a constant negotiation with the elements, never won, never ended. This knowledge was rarely written down. It was passed through apprenticeship, through watching and waiting, through years spent in the company of an older miller. A boy might begin by carrying sacks, sweeping flour, or oiling gears. Slowly he learned to hear the language of the stones, to read the water's speed, to test the grain in his hand. There were no manuals, no diagrams beyond the rough sketches used by millwrights. The craft lived in memory, in gesture, in habit. Apprenticeship was not a short term of months but years, during which the rhythm of the mill seeped into the apprentice's bones until he acted without thinking, his hands adjusting wedges and sluices as naturally as a farmer guided a plough. In this apprenticeship, mistakes were common but necessary. Too fine a grind, and the flour spoiled. Too coarse, and villagers complained of bread that rose poorly. Each error taught more than words could. The older miller corrected quietly, perhaps with a shake of the head or a muttered word, but mostly by letting the apprentice feel the consequence of error. Slowly, knowledge settled in, like flour drifting to rest on a beam. The miller's knowledge also extended to maintenance. He knew the sound of a loose cog, the smell of a beam beginning to rot, the feel of grease that had worn thin. He watched for sparks where iron met stone, for cracks in the great timbers, for the subtle shift of a wheel out of true. His hands were always busy with small tasks, tightening, oiling, scraping, patching. He was not only a grinder of grain, but a caretaker of a machine, both fragile and immense. Villagers sometimes mistook this quiet labor for idleness. They saw him standing by the stones, listening, waiting, adjusting by fractions, and thought him lazy compared to their toil in fields. Yet without his knowledge, their grain would be wasted. A careless miller could ruin a harvest's worth of flour in an afternoon, heating it, souring it, or leaving it half-ground. His craft was invisible precisely because it was successful. When done well, no one noticed. Only when it failed did complaints arise. Through centuries, this knowledge remained steady, even as mills changed from water to wind, and later to steam. The principles were the same: grain, moisture, stones, adjustment, power. Modernity brought iron rollers and mechanized sifters, but the old craft lingered in memory. The patience required, the attentiveness, the sense that the miller was less a master than a partner to his stones and his power source. These were lessons carried forward, though often unspoken. The miller's knowledge was not dramatic, not celebrated in chronicles or songs. It was slow, humble, and enduring. It lived in the quiet spaces between the turning of the wheel, in the hum of stones kept at just the right distance, in the steady stream of grain falling from hopper to furrow. It was not knowledge for glory but for sustenance, the kind of knowledge that fed villages and endured across generations. In this, the miller shared the patience of his stones, for both knew the value of small, steady, unending labor. If the stones of the mill were patient and impartial, grinding whatever grain was poured between them, the same could not be said of the miller in the eyes of his neighbors. The community depended on him, yet rarely did they trust him fully. His role was essential, but his reputation was burdened by suspicion, whispered slanders, and the persistent belief that millers took more than their share. The miller's toll, the small fraction of flour or grain taken as payment, was understood by all as necessary, yet it became the source of a deep unease, for it placed the miller in a position of invisible advantage. The toll was measured not in coins but in handfuls. Out of every sack poured into the hopper, the miller scooped a portion for himself. In theory, it was a fixed and fair amount, sanctioned by custom or lordly decree. In practice, the villagers could not see the grinding process once their grain disappeared into the chute. They delivered whole kernels and received flour in return. But how much was lost to dust, how much to inefficiency, and how much to the miller's quiet pocket? These were matters known only to the man inside the mill. The invisibility of the process gave rise to doubt, and doubt bred suspicion. It did not help that flour is a substance easy to alter and measure. Weighing flour is not the same as weighing grain, for moisture, fineness, and settling all affect the outcome. A dishonest miller could, in theory, keep back more than his due without villagers ever being able to prove it. Even if he did no such thing, the possibility alone was enough to stain his reputation. Every thin loaf that emerged from an oven, every meal that seemed lighter than expected, could be blamed on him. He became, in the imagination of many, the silent thief hidden behind turning stones. Folklore reflected this suspicion. Across Europe, proverbs and tales cast the miller as sly, greedy, or untrustworthy. In English sayings, the dishonest miller was almost a stock figure, blamed for pinching tolls or mixing meal with dust. The German proverb, "God save me from a bad neighbor," and a deceitful miller captured the unease that clung to the trade. Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, painted the miller as a bawdy, dishonest figure, red-faced, fond of ale, and unashamed in his trickery. Such images did not emerge in isolation. They grew out of centuries of suspicion that millers lived better than they ought to, that their prosperity was not entirely honest. Yet the suspicion had a deeper root in the structure of medieval society. Most villagers worked visibly, their labor plain to see. The ploughman bent in the field, the shepherd tended his flock, the blacksmith hammered at his forge. Their efforts were open, their toil transparent. The miller's labor, by contrast, happened behind wooden walls, aided by forces not entirely human. Water and wind powered his work, reducing his visible effort. He stood, he listened, he adjusted, but he did not sweat under the sun like the farmer. His labor seemed mysterious, even suspiciously easy, as though he profited from the gifts of nature without deserving them. Religion, too, played its part. Bread was not only food but sacrament, the host of the altar, the emblem of divine provision. To tamper with the process that created bread was to tamper with something sacred. The miller's toll, however fair in principle, looked to some like an intrusion upon holiness. If the baker transformed flour into bread, the priest into sacrament, then the miller's act of taking his portion seemed almost profane, as though he skimmed from the sacred stream. The burden of this symbolism weighed on his reputation more heavily than on others who traded goods. Still, the village needed him. They returned with sacks of grain, grumbled as they waited, muttered about his toll, but they came nonetheless. They might accuse him in jest, share tales of trickery at the hearth, or whisper warnings to their children about dishonest millers, but they also relied on his craft to keep hunger at bay. This dependence deepened the suspicion, for nothing feeds mistrust more than a need that cannot be escaped. In folklore, The mill often became a liminal space, half within the village and half outside it. Tales told of haunted mills, of stones turning by themselves at midnight, of devils lurking in corners, of millers making pacts with unseen forces. Such stories, fanciful though they were, reflected the sense that the miller's world was not entirely wholesome. The constant turning of the wheel, the hidden grinding of stones, the dust that clung to his clothes, all gave him an air of strangeness, a man touched by forces that ordinary villagers could neither control nor fully understand. The burden of reputation followed him even into festivals and fairs. Millers might be mocked in plays, lampooned in songs, or caricatured in stories told for amusement. The image of the greedy miller became almost archetypal, a shared cultural shorthand for dishonesty. It was a burden he carried, even if he lived with honesty and fairness. For once a trade is marked in imagination, it is hard for individuals to escape its shadow. There were, of course, honest millers, respected in their communities, men who served faithfully and were known for fairness. But even they could not wholly escape the cloud of mistrust. Their reputation was always fragile, vulnerable to rumor, to the dissatisfaction of a single villager who felt cheated, to the hunger of a poor family who found their bread too small. Trust once broken was hard to restore, and the burden of reputation meant that suspicion was always near. Over time, as milling became more centralized, as larger mills rose under the control of towns or lords, the burden did not vanish but changed form. The image of the greedy miller transformed into the suspicion of distant owners and merchants, yet the seed remained the same, unease about those who controlled the means of making bread. The burden of mistrust had less to do with individuals than with the structure of dependence itself. The miller then lived in tension. His craft required patience, knowledge, and diligence, yet his reputation bore the weight of suspicion, gossip, and folklore. He was indispensable and distrusted, necessary and mocked. In the patient hum of his stones, he may have found some comfort, for the stones did not accuse him, nor did they carry tales. But outside the mill house, among the people he served, he bore the invisible toll of mistrust, a burden passed down from generation to generation, as enduring as the millstones themselves. The figure of the miller lingers not only in the dust of abandoned mill houses, or the grooves of worn stones, but also in the surviving traces of words, where the work of farmers, shepherds, or ploughmen was sometimes too ordinary to merit detailed recording. Millers left behind a disproportionate presence in the surviving literature, rolls, and registers of medieval life. Perhaps it was their unique role at the crossroads of economy and sustenance, perhaps the mistrust that clung to their trade, or perhaps the simple fact that their tolls, their disputes, and their infractions invited formal recording. Whatever the reason, the miller appears again and again, preserved in both the careful ink of scribes and the imaginative flourishes of poets. Court rolls from manorial jurisdictions, preserved across England and much of continental Europe, contain millers as recurring figures in disputes. The records are not romantic, nor are they flattering. They describe fines levied for taking more than the customary toll, for mixing bran into flour, for failing to keep millstones in repair, or for neglecting obligations to the lord of the manor, who often owned the rights to the mill. These are not heroic appearances, but ordinary ones, situating the miller in the routine machinery of local justice. The fines were rarely ruinous, but their repetition gives a sense that millers were under continual scrutiny, watched by both lords and villagers. The miller thus emerges in history, less as a nameless worker, and more as a participant in the ceaseless friction of medieval society. Church records, too, preserve glimpses of millers. Tithes, those fractions of produce owed to the parish, sometimes mention millers explicitly, especially when disputes arose about whether tolls had been taken before or after tithes were measured. In an age when bread and grain had symbolic as well as material significance, such disputes carried moral weight. To be accused of tampering with measures or withholding dues was not only a civil fault but a spiritual failing, and church courts might summon millers to account for themselves. The persistence of these mentions across the centuries reveals how closely the trade of milling was tied to structures of authority, both secular and sacred. In the imaginative realm of literature, the miller took on a more vivid, though not always flattering, life. Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales immortalized the figure of the miller, with broad strokes, a stout man brawny, fond of taverns, skilled at playing the bagpipes, and infamous for his bawdy tales. The miller's tale itself, full of trickery, lust, and crude humor, is as far from the patient hum of real grindstones as could be imagined, yet it reflects the social caricature that had already attached itself to the trade. Chaucer's audience would have laughed knowingly at the image. They did not need convincing that millers were coarse or dishonest. The stereotype was familiar, and Chaucer amplified it for comic effect, nor was Chaucer alone. Medieval literature across Europe often cast millers as figures of trickery or excess. French fabliaux, short, comic tales, made frequent use of millers as characters, often caught in schemes of deception, lust, or theft. In German stories, the miller might appear as the butt of jokes, greedy for tolls or foolish in love. These tales were not meant to be documentary, but to amuse, yet they show how deeply the reputation of millers had entered popular imagination. The persistence of these depictions over centuries suggests that they resonated with common experience, or at least with common suspicion. Yet, in records as well as tales, one sees not only dishonesty but endurance. Millers, despite their fraught reputation, were embedded figures of rural economy. They appear in charters granting mill rights, in contracts for the construction of new mills, in lists of tenants obliged to grind their grain at the Lord's mill. These mentions, dry as they may seem, anchor the miller as a constant in village life. Where the ploughman's furrow left no record, the miller's toll, by its very nature, was counted, recorded, and contested. Thus the historian encounters him more frequently, his presence drawn not from heroics, but from the steady trace of transactions. Literature and records alike suggest that the miller was a figure both ordinary and peculiar. Ordinary, in that every village required one peculiar, in that he occupied a liminal role between necessity and suspicion. The survival of his image in texts reflects this duality. Court rolls present him as a practical problem to be regulated. Church records show him as a moral problem to be disciplined. Literature transforms him into a comic problem to be mocked. In each case he is more visible than his neighbors, though not in ways that conferred honor. This visibility makes the miller important for historians. Through him one can glimpse the tensions of medieval society between lord and peasant, between sacred and profane, between economic necessity and moral suspicion. The fact that millers appear so frequently in texts does not mean they were more numerous than other tradesmen, but rather that they occupied a position that demanded constant negotiation. Their tolls touched every household, their work touched the sacred bread, their mills stood at the edges of villages, half apart and half within. Such positions invite record, invite story, invite judgment. Even in later centuries, when printing presses spread and records became more abundant, the miller retained his literary and cultural presence. In the plays of early modern England, the figure of the miller might still be invoked as shorthand for dishonesty or rustic humor. In sermons, preachers might use the image of the greedy miller as a cautionary example. Thus the tradition extended, the caricature hardened, and the echoes of earlier centuries continued to shape perception long after. In the end, the miller who emerges from literature and records is not one man but a composite, part reality, part suspicion, part fiction. The dusty figure in Chaucer's tales is not the same as the miller found in a manorial court, yet both represent facets of the same enduring image. He is remembered not through monuments or epics, but through small notes in rolls, lines in satire, and the laughter of audiences who recognize the stereotype. He survives not as hero but as presence, faint but insistent, like the turning of a distant wheel. In the medieval world, bread was never merely sustenance, it was the central food of life, the common denominator of every table, the daily measure of survival. But bread was also charged with meaning far beyond the ordinary act of eating. It was tied to liturgy, to sacrament, to the mystery of faith itself. It was the body of Christ at the altar, the offering of the faithful, the very substance through which divine and human worlds touched. To grind grain into flour, therefore, was to stand in quiet proximity to something larger than commerce. The mill, by its nature, was never wholly secular. It was enmeshed in the spiritual structures of its age, and this tie between religion and milling left a long, patient trace upon history. From the earliest centuries of organized Christianity in Europe, mills were often bound to churches, monasteries, or ecclesiastical lords. A monastery that controlled land did not simply cultivate crops, it also controlled their transformation. To own a mill was to sit astride the essential link between grain and bread, between field and table. Monasteries, with their far-reaching estates, built watermills and windmills not only to serve their own communities, but to ensure that peasants dependent on their lands remained tied to ecclesiastical authority at every stage of sustenance. To bring grain to a monastery's mill was not only to engage in an economic exchange, but to acknowledge, in a subtle way, the reach of the church's hand into daily life. Tithes made this bond even more explicit. Every peasant was required to give 1/10 of produce to the parish, and questions of when and how that tenth should be measured often touched the mill. If grain was tithed before grinding, the burden was lighter for the villager. If after, the portion might feel heavier, for flour measured differently than whole kernels. These disputes often appear in church records, a sign of how closely the mill was tied to spiritual obligation. The act of grinding was not neutral. It altered the very material by which tithes were reckoned, and thus the miller's hand indirectly shaped the measure of religious duty. Some monasteries, especially the great Benedictine and Cistercian houses, became renowned for their technical expertise in milling. They constructed elaborate water systems, diverting streams and rivers to power mills not only for grain, but for fulling cloth or sawing timber. In these places, the line between prayer and labor blurred. The hum of a monastic mill was understood as part of the order's devotion, a sanctified rhythm in which the turning wheel became an extension of the community's work of ora et labora, prayer and labor, united. For monks, controlling mills was not merely a matter of income, but an embodiment of stewardship, a way of harnessing creation for the service of God. Yet for villagers outside those cloisters, the religious ties of mills often carried a different weight. To grind at a monastery's mill was not optional. Lords, secular or ecclesiastical, often held the banal right, which compelled tenants to use the lord's mill and pay the toll. To defy this was both an economic infraction and a moral one, for to resist the ecclesiastical mill was to resist the authority of the church itself. Stories survive of peasants caught secretly grinding grain at hand, querns in defiance of this right, fined for attempting to escape the toll, their resistance a quiet push against both economic burden and spiritual oversight. The parish, too, cast its eye upon mills or water rights. Disputes over mill dams and conflicts about diverted streams often became matters of moral as well as civil concern. To deprive a downstream neighbor of water through an ambitious mill race was not simply a matter of economics. It could be framed as a sin against charity, an offense against the balance of creation. Church courts sometimes handled such disputes, seeing in them more than mere property quarrels but questions of justice and neighborly duty. There was also the symbolic weight. Mills appeared in religious allegory, sermons, and visions. The grinding of wheat into flour was likened to the breaking of pride, the humbling of the soul, the transformation of the raw into the refined. The Eucharist itself drew upon this imagery, for the bread upon the altar was the fruit not only of field and oven, but also of the stones of the mill. In mystical writings, the soul might be described as grain, cast upon the millstone of God's will, ground down until it became something usable, nourishing, and fit for the divine table. Such images reveal how deeply the act of milling resonated with spiritual thought. At the same time, suspicion of millers carried a religious edge. A dishonest toll was not only theft but sin, for it tampered with the material of life and the substance of the sacrament. To cheat in grain or flour was to stand perilously close to sacrilege, to diminish not only bread for the body, but bread for the altar. Preachers could seize upon this, holding up the figure of the greedy miller as a warning to congregations. In the sermons of the medieval pulpit, the miller was sometimes invoked alongside the usurer or the dishonest merchant, his failings treated as examples of the corruption that threatened Christian society. Yet it would be too simple to say that mills were only burdens imposed by the church. For many villagers, the parish mill was also a source of stability. In times of famine, Monasteries might open their granaries, grind and distribute bread, and provide relief. The tie between mill and church could in such seasons mean survival. Monastic chronicles occasionally record the feeding of thousands during years of scarcity, when mills worked day and night to sustain not only monks but the surrounding populace. In these moments the religious tie of the mill revealed its charitable face, the wheel turning in service of mercy, rather than mere toll. Thus, the religious ties of mills formed a web of obligation, symbolism, suspicion, and sustenance. They were economic engines under ecclesiastical control, instruments of tithes, metaphors in sermons, and sometimes sources of charity in famine. To live in a medieval village was to live within this web, to bring grain to a mill not merely as a practical act but as one bound to larger structures of authority and belief. The wheel of the mill turned not only under the force of water or wind but under the weight of religion, spinning at once in the river's current and in the current of faith that shaped the medieval world. For centuries, the steady turn of wooden wheels and the patient grind of stone defined the rhythm of village life. Mills stood as familiar landmarks, their creaking timbers and humming stones serving entire communities with a constancy that seemed beyond change. Yet the quiet dominance of the village mill was not eternal. From the 17th century onward, and more decisively during the 18th and 19th, the creeping force of industrialization began to unsettle this ancient order. Slowly at first, then with greater speed, the humble wooden gears and quarried stones of the village mill gave way to iron machinery, towering urban mills, and the distant thrum of industrial power. The miller, once indispensable to the rhythms of a rural parish, found himself increasingly displaced, his craft fading into the margins of history. The change began with subtle shifts. In larger towns and cities, mills were constructed on a greater scale, their wheels driven by stronger currents, their gears reinforced with iron, their stones balanced with precision. These innovations allowed them to process more grain at greater speed. The economies of scale began to show. A town mill could grind not only for its own population but for surrounding villages, reducing the necessity of every hamlet maintaining its own creaking wheel by the brook. At first, this expansion was simply a matter of convenience, but over time it eroded the unique position of the local village miller. The 18th century brought another force. Steam, with the harnessing of steam engines for industrial work. The dependence on rivers and winds began to loosen. Mills could now be located where demand was greatest rather than where geography permitted. In London, in Paris, in Manchester and Hamburg, vast urban mills rose, their iron rollers and steam-driven belts processing grain in quantities unimaginable to their rural predecessors. Their flour did not merely feed a village but supplied entire regions. The wheel, once bound to a trickling stream, had been superseded by pistons and boilers, and with it the rhythm of milling shifted from seasonal and local to mechanical and centralized. The introduction of iron machinery further transformed the trade. Wooden cogs and shafts, so prone to wear and breakage, were gradually replaced by cast iron, which required less frequent repair and could transmit power more efficiently. Grindstones, while still used, began to be complemented or replaced by steel rollers, which crushed and refined grain with greater uniformity. Roller milling, perfected in the 19th century, produced flour that was whiter, finer, and longer lasting than the coarser wholemeal of traditional stones. Consumers, increasingly drawn to refined flour, accelerated the decline of older methods. The village mill, with its dust-laden timbers and uneven grind, appeared outdated beside the gleaming efficiency of roller mills. This technological encroachment carried social consequences. The village miller, once central to the economy of his parish, became less essential. Families who had once brought their sacks of barley, oats or wheat along winding paths to the local mill could now purchase flour directly in markets, transported by rail from distant industrial centers. The procession of villagers to the mill, once a social ritual, dwindled. The mill house, once a hub of quiet exchange and gossip, fell silent, its stones turning less frequently as custom declined. The hum that had once been the background music of rural life grew intermittent, then ceased altogether. Not all mills disappeared at once. In remote regions, in upland villages far from railways or towns, the old waterwheels continued their slow work into the late 19th century, sometimes even into the 20th. But they survived as exceptions, outliers of a system already overtaken. For many, their continued operation was less a matter of prosperity than of necessity, lingering on until the last farmer or shepherd reluctantly joined the current of industrial trade. By then, the once essential trade of the miller had become a relic, a profession remembered more in suspicion and folklore than in daily reliance. The decline of manual milling also reflected broader transformations in society. Industrialization concentrated production in cities, hollowing out many rural crafts. Just as hand spinning gave way to textile factories, so too the grinding of grain, once so intimate to local communities, became the domain of distant companies. Food, which had always been prepared within sight of its consumers, was increasingly processed far from home. Flour, once carried from field to mill and back to the village oven within a few days, could now travel across regions, packed in sacks, stored in warehouses, its origin unknown to the family who consumed it. The transparency of the old system, however mistrusted, was replaced by the anonymity of industry. In this shift, something intangible was lost. The creak of the wheel by the brook, the smell of damp wood and flour dust, the murmurs of neighbors waiting their turn, all were part of the fabric of rural memory. Industrial mills, efficient though they were, offered no such intimacy. They were vast, impersonal, inaccessible to the ordinary villager. Their product was uniform, but their presence was distant, unvisited by children, untouched by the gossip of families, unmarked by the seasonal floods or freezes that once dictated the pace of the wheel. What had been personal became industrial, what had been communal became commercial. Yet decline did not mean disappearance. Many mills fell into ruin, their timbers rotting, their wheels stilled, their mill ponds silted over. Others were adapted, converted into barns, homes, or small factories. In some regions, the charm of their antiquity preserved them, turned into heritage sites, museums, or picturesque landmarks for a society that now looked back nostalgically on what it had once abandoned. The decline of manual milling, therefore, became not an erasure, but a transformation, an old rhythm stilled, but not entirely forgotten. The miller himself, once a figure of both necessity and suspicion, passed into memory. His reputation, his toll, his dust-stained clothes, became part of rural lore, rather than lived experience. By the late 19th century, children might hear stories of the dishonest miller, or the haunted mill, at the edge of the village without ever having taken a sack of grain to one. The figure who had once stood at the heart of rural economy was reduced to a character in tales, his craft subsumed by iron, steam, and the logic of industrial trade. Thus, the decline of manual milling was not a sudden collapse but a long patient erosion, mirroring the slow grinding of the very stones it described. The wheel turned less often, then not at all. The stones grew silent, the dust settled, and the hum that had filled villages for centuries passed into memory. What remained was the industrial thrum of machines in distant cities, efficient but impersonal, productive but detached. In this way, the decline of the miller marked not only the end of a craft, but the reshaping of how human beings related to bread, to labor, and to one another. When the last sacks of grain ceased to arrive, and when the final handfuls of flour drifted down from the stones, many mills were simply left to their fate. Their decline was rarely abrupt. It was a slow dimming, a gradual silencing of sounds once constant. The brook still flowed, the wind still crossed the uplands, but the wheels no longer turned, and the steady hum that had anchored rural life dissolved into silence. The buildings remained, at first still sturdy with their stone walls and timber beams, but with no hands to care for them. They entered into another life, that of abandonment. The sight of an empty mill was different from other disused buildings. A barn, when neglected, collapsed into the field and returned to the earth. A cottage, when abandoned, became a tangle of ivy and broken chimneys. But a mill, with its wheel or its tower, its sluices, races, and stones, seemed less like an ordinary ruin and more like a ghost. It had been a place of motion, a place defined by sound and rhythm, and when stilled, its absence of movement was striking. The wheel, once dripping with water, or whirring with the pull of wind, stood immobile, a circle of mossed wood or rusting iron, leaning toward the stream that no longer fed it. Along riverbanks, where water had once been carefully managed through channels and ponds, silence fell. Mill races clogged with silt and reeds, dams gave way under floods, and mill ponds turned into stagnant marshes. Frogs and insects replaced the noise of rushing water, and what had been engineered landscapes returned slowly to nature's pattern. Fishermen might cast a line where once a wheel splashed, unaware of the careful geometry of sluices that lay submerged beneath the water's surface. The ghosts of the mill remained, but in quiet forms, half visible and easily overlooked. On uplands where windmills had stood, the picture was different. The tall, skeletal forms of towers or post mills, once landmarks for miles, fell into neglect. Wooden sails rotted, their canvas long since tattered to threads, until only beams jutted from the tower like bones. Sometimes, villagers stripped the timber for other uses, leaving the hollow shell of a tower to stand alone on the ridge, its door swinging in the wind, its empty cap turning no more. Travelers might still use such ruins as points of orientation. Beyond the old mill became a phrase fixed in local maps of memory, but the mill itself had become nothing more than a husk. The emptiness of these places inspired stories. A working mill was always associated with noise, dust, and the hum of activity, so its sudden stillness seemed unnatural. People told tales of millstones that turned at night without water or wind, powered by unseen forces. Children were warned not to wander into abandoned mills, lest spirits lingered there. Folklore already suspected millers of dealings beyond the ordinary, and when their buildings stood hollow, the suspicion deepened. Ghost stories clung to them, of spectral millers seen at windows, of phantom wheels creaking in moonlight, of cries from the black recesses where flour dust had long settled. But beyond imagination, the abandonment of mills also carried practical weight. Communities that had once revolved around their presence lost a landmark. The absence was felt not only in the silence of the wheel, but in the dispersal of social ties. Where once villagers had gathered, exchanged news and shared quiet company, there was now only an empty structure, avoided by some, overlooked by others. The mill had been a subtle anchor, and when it vanished, the village's rhythm shifted in ways difficult to trace but no less real. For historians and wanderers centuries later, the ghosts of these empty mills became sites of curiosity. Their ruins dotted landscapes, each telling a story of vanished labor. In northern Europe, moss-covered watermills could still be found tucked into valleys, their walls standing though roofs had fallen, their wheels long gone. In southern England, hollow brick towers of windmills stood on hills, stripped of sails but still casting shadows across fields. In France, Spain and the Low Countries, ruins of mills mingled with castles and chapels as remnants of an older economy, once as vital as warfare or worship, but now reduced to stone and silence. Some were not entirely lost. Certain mills, abandoned for decades, were later rediscovered and restored, their mechanisms rebuilt for demonstration or preserved as museums. Yet even when revived, they carried the sense of being ghosts, performing motions once essential, but now only symbolic. A turning wheel, once the heartbeat of a village, became a tourist's curiosity, a relic of how people once lived. The authenticity of the hum was gone, for no family waited with sacks of grain, no community gossiped at the door. What remained was memory, embodied in stone and timber, but detached from life. The ghostliness of empty mills also lies in their persistence. A ploughed field can be turned into meadow in a season, a cottage can vanish in a decade, but mills, with their durable stones and solid walls, endure long after their function is lost. They stand half-hidden in woodlands, their wheels overtaken by ivy, their millstones sunk into the earth like gravestones. They do not disappear, they linger, and in their lingering, they remind us that the rhythms of past centuries do not vanish cleanly, but echo faintly through the landscape. Sometimes, a traveler might come upon one by accident. A walk along a forgotten stream might reveal a wall, a broken arch where water once flowed, or the round outline of a millstone discarded. In such moments, the ghost of the mill is felt strongly. It is not only the ruin of a building, but the residue of an entire way of life, the procession of villagers, the creak of gears, the dust of flour in sunlight, all reduced to fragments in stone and wood. The imagination supplies the rest, and in silence, one almost hears the hum again. Thus, the ghosts of empty mills are not simply ruins. They are presences in absence, reminders of how something once so constant could fade into stillness. They are relics of labor and necessity, now left to wind and water, their voices hushed but not gone. The miller is absent, the villagers dispersed, the stones stilled, yet the building remains as testimony. The ghost of the mill is not frightening, but haunting in a quieter sense, a gentle persistence, an enduring shape in the landscape that speaks of patience, decline, and the inevitability of change. When the last millstones fell silent, and the buildings began to crumble into quiet ruin, the world seemed ready to leave them behind, to let time and ivy complete their work. Yet not all people were content to forget. There were always a few who looked upon the hollow shells of watermills, and the broken towers of windmills, and felt that something more lingered there than simple abandonment. These were not only locals who remembered the days when such places turned with life, but also antiquarians, scholars, and later, organized societies who saw the fading presence of the mill as part of a larger story that ought not to vanish entirely. Out of their patience and attention grew the preservation movement, the slow work of recording, conserving, and sometimes reviving mills that otherwise would have slipped quietly into the earth. The first wave of such interest belonged to antiquarians in the 18th and 19th centuries. These men, and they were most often men of leisure or scholarship, wandered through landscapes cataloguing ruins, sketching towers, and noting the remnants of old technologies. They were usually more interested in castles, churches, and Roman villas, but occasionally a ruined mill caught their eye. A mill, after all, carried a different sort of antiquity, not the grandeur of empire, or the romance of chivalry, but the quiet trace of daily necessity. Antiquarians sometimes described the wheel races overgrown with reeds, or the round millstones abandoned by the roadside, recognizing them as markers of a rural life, already changing under the pressure of industrial towns and steam power. By the mid-19th century, the tone shifted. As industrialization transformed England, France, Germany, and beyond, nostalgia for the countryside grew stronger. Writers and artists began to notice mills, not only as functional ruins, but as picturesque elements in the landscape. Painters of the Romantic school, wandering riversides, often set old mills against the flow of water or the glow of evening skies. Their canvases did not describe the labor once carried out inside, but they captured the sense of the mill as a fading emblem of harmony between human effort and nature. This aesthetic appreciation, though detached from the lives of real millers, prepared the ground for the idea that such buildings might be worth preserving for beauty's sake alone. Local memory also played its role. In many villages, the mill was the most distinctive structure, more enduring than cottages and barns. Parish histories, written by clergymen or educated villagers, often included sketches of the old mill and notes about the families who had worked there. These records were not preservation in the physical sense, but they were acts of remembrance. They kept the mill in the collective identity of the community, so that when walls fell or roofs caved in, the image of the building survived on paper and in story. The 20th century brought a stronger, more organized phase of preservation. As rural traditions declined under the weight of mechanized agriculture and urban expansion, historians of technology began to see mills as vital artifacts of pre-industrial life. They were, in effect, museums waiting to be recognized, structures that embodied centuries of craft, engineering, and social relations. In Britain, societies such as the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings (SPAB), founded in the 1870s, eventually took mills under their wing, campaigning to save particular watermills or windmills from demolition. The mills section of SPAB, formed in 1931, was especially significant, gathering architects, engineers, and enthusiasts who dedicated themselves to recording and restoring these declining buildings. Recording became as important as saving. Surveyors carefully measured surviving mills, noting the angles of gears, the size of stones, the design of sluices. Photographers captured exteriors and interiors before decay advanced further. Such documentation ensured that even if the physical mill could not be rescued, its form would not be entirely lost. In many cases, these records later served as blueprints for partial or full restoration, allowing modern craftsmen to rebuild broken parts with accuracy. Restoration itself was a delicate matter. To save a mill was not simply to patch its walls, but to decide what form of life it should have in the present. Some restorations aimed to return the building to working order, with wheels turning once again, not for the sustenance of villagers, but for demonstration to visitors. Others preserved mills as static monuments, cleaned and stabilized but left silent, reminders of what they had once been. In both cases, there was always a balance between authenticity and adaptation. The ironwork of the 19th century might be retained alongside medieval timbers. New machinery might be installed to replicate vanished parts. Each mill thus became a composite of its layered history and the hands that saved it. The preservation movement was not limited to Britain. In the Netherlands, windmills had long been seen as national symbols, tied to the identity of a country that fought continually against the sea. Large-scale efforts to protect and restore Dutch mills began in the early 20th century and grew after the devastation of the Second World War. Whole landscapes, such as the Kinderdijk network of windmills, were preserved, not as isolated ruins but as functioning ensembles, celebrated today as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Similar movements appeared in Germany, Denmark, and across Europe, each nation developing its own societies of mill enthusiasts and technical historians. In North America, where mills had been vital to colonial settlements, preservation also gained ground. The United States, with its historical societies and interest in heritage tourism, saw many early watermills restored as museums, often staffed with interpreters in period clothing. These mills, while sometimes heavily romanticized, allowed visitors to see grain ground into flour, to smell the dust in the air, and to imagine the daily rhythm of work. Canada, too, saved several important mills, recognizing their role in shaping rural economies. Not all preservation was formal or scholarly. Sometimes, it was a matter of personal care. A family inheriting an old mill might choose to maintain it, patching the roof, oiling the gears, not out of public duty, but from attachment to ancestry. In such cases, the mill survived as a private heirloom, less visible, but no less meaningful. And sometimes farmers adapted the structures for new uses: a barn, a storehouse, even a dwelling. In these transformations, the original purpose was blurred, but the building itself endured, carrying its ghost of milling work within walls repurposed for other needs. Today, the preservation of mills continues as a combination of scholarship, local pride, and tourism. Across Europe and beyond, festivals celebrate the turning of mill wheels, and heritage days open restored sites to visitors. Guides explain the old mechanics, turning what was once common knowledge into rare information. The quiet work of millers is remembered not through daily necessity, but through curated experience. The mills themselves, whether restored or left as picturesque ruins, stand as survivors against oblivion. In this way, preservation efforts weave together the past and the present. They remind us that the mill was not merely a machine but a center of human life, a place where technology, community, and nature met. Without such efforts, the last traces of these buildings might have disappeared entirely, leaving only faint mentions in archives. With them, however, the ghost of the mill remains visible, tangible, and enduring, a presence that invites the imagination to turn again with the stones. When one tries to measure the worth of a life or a profession, it is often the loud, the visible, and the celebrated that leave their imprint most clearly. Kings are remembered by chronicles, merchants by ledgers, knights by ballads, and preachers by sermons. But the quiet labor that sustains existence day by day often leaves behind only faint traces. The work of millers was of this quieter kind, rarely praised, often mistrusted, frequently forgotten. Yet their contribution to the survival of villages and the growth of communities was profound. It was a legacy almost invisible, because it worked not in moments of drama, but in the ordinary and the repetitive. The grinding of grain, the production of flour, the assurance that bread would be there at the table when it was most needed. Bread, across much of Europe, was not merely food but the foundation of life. In medieval England, It was said that 3/4 of the common diet was made of bread. In France, grain shortages could trigger unrest, even revolt, because the absence of bread was felt as an existential threat. This reliance was not unique to Europe. Wherever cereals became staple crops, wheat, barley, rye, oats, millet, or rice, the grinding of grain was essential to survival. The miller stood at the junction of this necessity. Farmers grew the grain, bakers turned flour into bread, but the miller's role was the essential hinge that connected field to oven. Without the mill, grain remained locked in its hard husk, difficult to eat, wasteful to cook, and poor in nourishment. With the mill, it became the flour that nourished households, monasteries, armies, and cities. The miller's invisible legacy can be traced not in monuments but in the steady sustenance of human life. Every sack of grain he processed carried within it the possibility of feeding a family for a week, of keeping children alive through winter, of allowing laborers the strength to work the next day in the fields. Villages could not have persisted without this dependable transformation. Grain itself might be harvested in abundance, but without milling, it could not become the bread that held the community together. Thus, the miller's work, though repetitive and unglamorous, was woven into the continuity of survival itself. Communities grew around mills for precisely this reason. A settlement with a mill had the assurance of security, the promise that its crops would not only be grown but also be made edible. Mills provided the means by which villages stabilized, flour being a commodity that could be stored, traded, and carried to markets. The presence of a mill encouraged the building of churches, taverns, and homes nearby, because it created an economic and social center. In some regions, the foundation of a new mill could lead to the gradual development of a town. The structure might appear modest compared to castles or cathedrals, but in its way it was equally decisive for the shaping of the landscape of settlement. Invisible, too, was the way milling sustained not only the body but also the rhythms of culture, the cycle of grain harvest, the storage of sacks, the procession to the mill, the waiting for flour, and the return home. All these rituals marked the passing of weeks and seasons. Festivals of harvest were linked indirectly to the mill, for without its turning stones the bounty of the fields could not be consumed. In times of famine or scarcity, it was again the mill that stood at the center of anxiety, its wheels slowing when rivers froze or when drought left ponds empty. Even the silence of the mill left its mark, a reminder of how dependent communities were upon its hidden labor. Though mistrusted for petty dishonesty, millers also carried knowledge that underpinned agricultural economies. Their skill in judging grain, its weight, its dryness, its suitability for different stones, ensured that crops were used efficiently. A miller who worked well preserved the value of a harvest, ensuring it yielded the maximum flour and wasted little. Over time, this technical knowledge, passed quietly from apprentice to master, increased the productivity of villages and contributed to the broader growth of medieval and early modern economies. Without such steady accumulation of small efficiencies, the expansion of populations and towns would have faltered. The legacy of millers is also visible in language and metaphor, though rarely acknowledged. Millstones appear in proverbs, flour in idioms, wheels in folk speech. To go through the mill became a phrase for enduring hardship. To be ground down spoke of suffering. The imagery of milling, born from the ordinary experience of rural people, became part of the fabric of expression, long after the individual millers themselves were forgotten. Such linguistic traces testify to how deeply their work had entered into the consciousness of those they served, even when direct acknowledgement was absent. In certain ways, the invisibility of their legacy mirrors the humility of the mill itself. Unlike cathedrals, built to display grandeur, or castles, meant to dominate, mills were constructed to function. Their beauty was accidental, arising from the balance of water, timber, and stone, not from deliberate artistry. They stood quietly by rivers, or on ridges, their presence felt through sound and rhythm, rather than spectacle. Their legacy, like their form, was quiet endurance, a support structure on which louder histories depended. When one looks at demographic records, the growth of populations in the High Middle Ages, the resilience of villages through harsh winters, the capacity of armies to march on bread. One sees the faint shadow of millers behind these patterns. They are rarely named, yet their labor ensured the continuity of these larger stories. The expansion of medieval Europe, the rise of towns, the flourishing of monasteries that fed both monks and the poor, all these depended upon the dependable grinding of grain. The invisible becomes visible when seen in this broader perspective. Even after industrial mills replaced local ones, the legacy remained. The idea that flour should be available in every town, that bread should be a daily food, that grain should move seamlessly from harvest to consumption, all these habits had been shaped over centuries by the work of countless unnamed millers. To modern societies inherit their patterns without realizing it. The convenience of a loaf bought from a shop owes something to the generations of millers who taught communities that bread could and should be an everyday certainty. Thus the miller's invisible legacy is not found in statues or chronicles, but in continuities of life itself. It lingers in the survival of villages, the persistence of bread as staple food, the endurance of proverbs, and the very expectation that sustenance should be steady and reliable. To notice it is to see how history is shaped not only by grand figures, but also by the quiet constancy of those whose work underpinned existence. The hum of the mill, though now mostly silenced, still echoes in every loaf of bread, in every community that once grew around a wheel or a pair of stones, in every word and memory that milling left behind. When the stones grew quiet, when the water wheel slowed, and when the wooden timbers of the mill creaked in the evening silence, the building seemed to take on a life of its own. Perhaps it was inevitable that such places would be woven into the tapestry of folklore. The mill was never simply a machine of wood and stone, it was an unfamiliar kind of building, half natural, half artificial, fed by water or wind, but transformed by human craft into something that seemed to possess its own heartbeat. It was not surprising that rural imagination clothed it in mystery, and that the miller, who understood its workings and controlled its rhythms, became a figure of suspicion, humor, and legend. Folklore surrounding mills drew much of its strength from the sounds. A watermill, even in sleep, was never fully silent. The steady drip of water, the creak of swollen wood, the soft groan of timbers settling in the night, these were noises that could be heard by those who passed nearby. For villagers who did not understand the machinery inside, such sounds seemed almost alive, like the sighs or murmurs of a slumbering creature. Tales arose of millstones that continued turning after midnight, without the aid of water or wind, as though some unseen power kept them in motion. In some regions of Germany and Scandinavia, there were whispers that such mills were worked by spirits, or by the restless dead, who ground their own phantom grain through endless nights. The figure of the miller himself was not immune to superstition. Folklore often cast him as sly or untrustworthy, a man who lived slightly apart from the rest of the village, who weighed grain and flour in ways others could not easily verify. The very skill that sustained the community also marked him as suspect. In English and French tales alike, the miller was sometimes portrayed as greedy, shaving off a little extra flour for himself, or as bawdy and lustful, a trickster figure who lived by wits as much as labor. Chaucer's Miller's Tale, bawdy and mocking, is one of the best-known literary echoes of this folk suspicion. Though it belongs to a broader pattern, across Europe, the miller's reputation was tinged with mistrust. At the same time, millers could also appear in folklore as figures of uncanny knowledge, because they worked at the meeting place of natural forces, water and wind. They were imagined to have access to secrets. Some stories associated them with weather magic, the ability to summon rain or wind to calm a storm or to curse the crops of rivals. In the Scottish Highlands, legends told of millers who dealt with the Sith or fairies, trading flour for favours or bargaining to keep the machinery safe. In Central Europe, where mills often stood at the edges of villages, they were liminal places, half inside and half outside society, and such thresholds were always fertile ground for superstition. Haunted mills became a recurring motif in folk stories. A disused mill at the edge of a woodland was a perfect setting for tales of ghosts. Travelers reported hearing wheels creaking, though the pond lay still, Lights were seen glimmering from windows where no miller lived. In parts of Eastern Europe, stories were told of millers who had cheated their customers and were doomed to turn the stones after death, their spectres bound eternally to the mill. In England, it was sometimes said that those who died tragically in or near mills, drowned in the mill pond, crushed by a wheel, or caught in gears, lingered as uneasy spirits. The building itself, with its shadowy lofts and echoing chambers, encouraged such imagination. Animals, too, entered into mill folklore. The constant presence of mice and rats around sacks of grain gave rise to tales of uncanny creatures, sometimes demons in disguise, who feasted upon the harvest. Cats kept in mills were believed in some regions to be protectors, warding off not only vermin but also evil spirits. In Baltic countries, there were stories of black cats haunting abandoned mills, companions of witches who gathered flour for magical rituals. Such associations further deepened the aura of the mill, as a place half natural, half supernatural. Millstones themselves carried symbolic weight. To see them idle could be ominous, suggesting famine or misfortune. A broken millstone was sometimes read as a sign of a curse, a failure of the community's fortune. In parts of France, fragments of worn millstones were kept as charms, believed to protect households from bad luck or lightning. In Northern Europe, travelers carried small chips of stone from mills as talismans against hunger. Thus, even as physical objects, millstones carried meanings beyond their work, inhabiting both practical and symbolic worlds. Even festivals and superstitions intertwined with mills. In some regions, the first grinding of new harvest grain was accompanied by blessings, prayers, or folk rituals meant to ensure prosperity. The miller might sprinkle flour at thresholds or scatter it in fields as a charm for abundance. Conversely, if the first grinding failed, if the flour came out coarse, or if the stone cracked, it was feared as a portent of hard times ahead. Such beliefs reinforced the sense that milling was not a neutral craft but a hinge upon which fortune could turn. The darker edge of mill folklore often reflected the anxieties of dependence. Villagers relied utterly on mills, yet they did not fully understand them. The machinery was hidden behind walls, its workings known only to the miller and perhaps his apprentice. Such opacity bred suspicion, and suspicion gave rise to stories. Mills became sites where human trust in technology met human unease with the unknown, and folklore filled the gap. The miller who seemed too prosperous might be whispered to have made a pact with the devil. The building that groaned at night might be said to harbor restless souls. These tales were less about the truth of millers than about the fears of those who brought their grain, their dependence translated into superstition. Over time, as real mills declined and became ruins, folklore only thickened. An abandoned mill, half collapsed beside a river or standing silent on a ridge, was a perfect canvas for ghost stories. Children were warned to stay away, told that spirits turned the stones by moonlight, or that cries could be heard beneath the floorboards. What had once been the heart of village life now became its haunted periphery. In this transformation, one sees clearly how folklore preserves memory. The mill did not vanish, it changed into legend, its hum becoming a whisper of the uncanny. Even today, the echo of these superstitions lingers. Folklorists in the 20th century recorded countless mill tales from rural storytellers, haunted mill ponds in Yorkshire, phantom wheels in Germany, spectral millers in Russia. Though the craft itself is gone, the stories endure, passed down in books, in local traditions, and in the imagination of those who wander past ruins. Mills in this way remain alive, not through the turning of stones but through the tales that continue to circle around them like invisible wheels. Though the village mill of medieval Europe may feel like a distant particular world, the act of milling, of harnessing water, wind or simple human strength to grind grain, was never confined to one region. It was, and still is, a universal rhythm of human survival. Across continents, across climates, and across centuries, communities created their own forms of mills, shaping machines that looked different in wood, stone or iron, but which shared the same essential purpose: to break grain into food, to turn harvest into nourishment. The universality of milling can be glimpsed in the simple fact that no society that depended on cereals, wheat, barley, rice, maize, millet, could avoid the task of grinding. In the earliest ages, this was done by hand, with stone querns or mortars, laboring for hours to produce enough flour for a day's bread. But gradually, almost everywhere, human ingenuity sought ways to multiply effort. In doing so, the watermill, the windmill, and countless regional variants were born. In Europe, the image of the watermill beside a village stream, or the windmill rising on a low ridge, became familiar by the Middle Ages. These machines did not only lighten labor, they became landmarks, symbols of sustenance, and nodes of community life. Yet, while Europeans were turning streams into millponds, a parallel story was unfolding in the Middle East. Along the banks of the Orontes, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, great waterwheels known as nories were constructed. Unlike the European mill, which usually housed its wheels within timber buildings, these nories were monumental open wheels, often adorned with wooden buckets that scooped up water as they turned. Their main purpose was irrigation, lifting water into aqueducts to feed fields and gardens. But alongside them were mills that ground grain, harnessing the same force of flowing rivers. In Syria, remnants of these vast wheels still stand, their broad spokes weathered, their creaking remembered in poetry and song. Further east, in India and China, the ingenuity of milling took on its own forms. In rural India, the gatter or traditional watermill was a simple yet effective device, using small mountain streams to spin wooden paddles that turned a vertical shaft. These powered millstones that ground wheat, maize, or millet, often tucked into Himalayan valleys. These mills remained part of village life for centuries, their steady hum blending with the sound of rivers. In China, archaeological and textual evidence reveals water-powered mills from as early as the Han Dynasty. These machines were used not only for grain, but also for pounding, papermaking, and other crafts, demonstrating how the idea of harnessing water spread into many aspects of daily life. Rice, the staple grain of East and Southeast Asia, generated its own traditions of milling. Here the challenge was not simply grinding, but removing husks from delicate grains. From Japan to Thailand, wooden mortars and pestles, sometimes powered by waterwheels, sometimes by treadles, were designed for this task. In rural villages, women often gathered around these rice mills, the rhythmic pounding of wooden beams becoming part of the social and sonic landscape. Some of these methods survive even today, as cultural demonstrations or in small-scale use, where the old ways have not been fully replaced by modern machines. Africa, too, has its continuity of milling traditions. In parts of North Africa, water mills appeared in antiquity, their Roman and Islamic heritage shaping local practice. In sub-Saharan Africa, however, grinding often remained a more communal act. Women used large stone mortars, pounding sorghum, millet, or maize in rhythms that became songs. Yet even here, water and wind-driven mills made appearances where geography allowed, blending global invention with local tradition. The Americas carried their own story. Before European contact, indigenous peoples used grinding stones metates in Central and South America, often ornately carved, to process maize into flour or dough. These were not simply tools but culturally significant objects, passed down through generations. With colonization came the introduction of watermills and windmills, brought from Europe and adapted to new landscapes. In the early United States, the watermill was among the first symbols of industrial progress, powering not only flour but also sawmills, textile mills and ironworks. Yet even as great urban mills rose, indigenous traditions of hand grinding persisted, echoing the diversity of milling across the globe. What is striking in all these examples is the continuity of the basic impulse to use nature's force to relieve human labor. Whether through the slow turn of a water wheel in a French hamlet, the towering noria in a Syrian town, the rice-pounding mortars of a Thai village, or the maize-grinding metate in a Mexican household, the act of milling reveals a shared human endeavor. It is a quiet but profound reminder that civilizations distant and diverse often meet at the same practical needs. The universality of mills also produced quiet parallels in culture. In Europe, mills entered folklore as haunted or uncanny. In Japan, rice mortars appeared in folk songs and seasonal rituals. In the Middle East, the creaking of great wheels became part of local poetry, symbolizing both abundance and the flow of time. In all these cases, the machines were not merely mechanical, They were woven into stories, songs and symbols, given a place in the human imagination, as well as in daily sustenance. Industrialization, of course, shifted this universality into a new scale. In the 19th and 20th centuries, steel rollers and vast mechanized plants replaced most local mills, yet even as industrial bread, rice and maize spread, the old mills retained a cultural presence. In Europe, restored watermills now stand as heritage sites. In Syria, the ruined norias remain symbols of local identity. In Japan, traditional rice pounding is reenacted at festivals. In Mexico, the mete continues to be used in households where tradition holds strong. Across the globe then, milling survives both as memory and as practice, bridging ancient necessity with modern nostalgia. The continuity of milling is not only about machines but also about what they represent, the transformation of raw harvest into life. Grain by itself is hard, unyielding, inedible. Only when cracked, ground or husked, does it become bread, rice, porridge or tortilla. The mill, in whatever form, performs this alchemy, and it is this act, more than any particular design, that binds cultures together. It is no exaggeration to say that without mills, human civilization could not have grown as it did. They stand, in many forms, as one of the quiet foundations of survival. And so, when we think of the old European watermill on its quiet stream, we might also picture the Syrian noria creaking in the sun, the Chinese rice pestle thudding in rhythm, the Mexican metate rocking under skilled hands. Each is different, but each answers the same call to turn the harvest of the earth into the daily bread of humanity. This is the global continuity of milling, an invisible thread binding villages, towns and peoples across time, across distance, across cultures. In the stillness of abandoned villages, in the quiet edges of rivers where moss-covered wheels no longer move, and in the open fields where windmills stand like skeletons against the horizon, there lingers the memory of the miller. Their work, their machines, their presence in the landscape, though once ordinary and essential, has largely slipped into obscurity. And yet, if one looks carefully, the role of the miller has never quite vanished. It lives on in fragments, in restored buildings, in folk tales, in forgotten entries of parish records, in the turning of a preserved wheel for tourists, and in the taste of bread itself, which carries within it the echo of a labor once central to survival. The story of milling is not a tale of sudden invention or dramatic collapse, but rather one of slow endurance and equally slow fading. The first millers, crouched over stone querns in prehistoric huts, could not have imagined the vast waterwheels of medieval monasteries or the tall windmills of the Dutch lowlands. Yet the link is unbroken. The same act of transforming grain into flour carried forward, patiently, generation after generation. The work changed its tools, but not its essence. The patience of this continuity mirrors the patience of the millstones themselves. Each stone, carved from quarries with care, could last for decades, sometimes centuries. They turned endlessly, wearing themselves down grain by grain, just as history itself wears down monuments and memories. The miller's patience was matched by the millstones, both bound to the slow rhythm of turning, grinding, feeding and repeating. Nothing in the mill was hurried. The water's flow could not be rushed. The wind's direction could not be forced. Milling was an art of waiting, adjusting and enduring, a craft shaped by time rather than by urgency. The social world of the miller was equally slow in its erosion. For centuries millers were figures of mistrust as well as necessity. Villagers depended on them for bread, but whispered accusations of dishonesty. Clergy counted their tithes, lords claimed their rights, and poets like Chaucer mocked them in verse. And yet, in every village, the miller was always there, standing as both servant and gatekeeper of sustenance. To speak of the decline of mills is not only to speak of machines being abandoned, but of an entire social figure receding into anonymity. When industrialization arrived, it brought with it the sound of new mills, loud, metallic, urban. Roller mills with steel teeth and mechanized belts could process grain on scales unimaginable to village wheels. Bread production became a matter of industry rather than community, and with that, the quiet figure of the rural miller faded from prominence. Their craft was no longer needed, their buildings were no longer efficient, their role once woven into the cycle of daily life became obsolete. What remained were shells of structures, stories of suspicion, and occasional references in archives. Yet the persistence of memory has its own rhythm. Local historians, antiquarians, and rural enthusiasts began to write about mills in the 19th century, fearing their disappearance. In the 20th century, heritage societies and museums preserved them, ensuring that at least some would remain. Today one can still visit working mills in Britain, France, Germany and beyond. One can hear the sound of water rushing into wooden buckets, the grinding of stones, and the steady hum of gears. These are echoes, yes, but echoes kept alive by human care. Folklore too preserves what history might have forgotten. Haunted mills, cursed millstones, ghostly millers wandering at dusk. These tales stretch across cultures. They are reminders that even when people mistrusted the miller in life, they could not quite let go of them in memory. Superstition gave them a presence beyond their trade, embedding them in the imagination of the community. It is telling that many ghost stories from rural Europe end not in castles or forests but in mills, where the ordinary work of grinding was invested with mystery. Globally, the continuity of milling reinforces this reflection. In Syria, ruined norias stand as monuments to vanished labor. In Mexico, the mete still rests in kitchens, as it did centuries ago. In India, gate mills turn in mountain streams, serving families as they always have. And in Europe, windmills remain symbols of nationhood, etched into landscapes and national identities. Though the traditional miller may be forgotten, the tools they used, the machines they built, and the food they enabled still bind humanity together. In this sense, the final turning of the wheel is not an ending but a folding into the larger fabric of history. Mills and millers may no longer anchor villages in the way they once did, but their essence lingers in the endurance of bread as the cornerstone of diet, in the landscapes shaped by watercourses, diverted for mill ponds, and in the cultural memory that insists on preserving at least fragments of their world. Every slice of bread, every bowl of rice carries within it a history of grinding and patience, of turning wheels and waiting hands. To reflect on the miller, then, is to reflect on endurance itself. Their lives were not grand, not marked by conquest or drama, but by steady persistence. They remind us that history is not only made by kings and wars, but also by those who kept the daily rhythm of survival alive. They stood in their mills as the centuries passed, watching floods and droughts, listening to gossip and superstition, maintaining stones and gears, until time itself rendered their labor obsolete. But even as their presence faded, the world they supported endured. The wheel has turned, and it has slowed, but it has not stopped entirely. A few wheels still turn in streams and on hillsides, kept alive by memory and preservation. In those moments one can imagine the world as it was, the creak of timber, the rush of water, the slow grinding of stone. It is a lullaby of history, a sound that once fed countless families and now feeds memory itself. The final turning of the wheel is in truth never final. It is simply another cycle, reminding us that patience, endurance, and the quiet work of forgotten people are as much a part of history as any battle or empire.